Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 11. But deeds and language such as men do use, and persons such as comedy would choose, when she would show an image of the times, and sport with human follies, not with crimes. Ben Jonson. Lydgate, in fact, was already conscious of being fascinated by a woman strikingly different from Miss Brooke. He did not in the least suppose that he had lost his balance and fallen in love, but he had said of that particular woman, "She is grace itself. She is perfectly lovely and accomplished. That is what a woman ought to be. She ought to produce the effect of exquisite music." Plain women he regarded as he did the other severe facts of life, to be faced with philosophy and investigated by science. But Rosamond Vincy seemed to have the true melodic charm, and when a man has seen the woman whom he would have chosen if he had intended to marry speedily, his remaining a bachelor will usually depend on her resolution rather than on his. Lydgate believed that he should not marry for several years, not marry until he had trodden out a good clear path for himself away from the broad road which was quite ready-made. He had seen Miss Vincy above his horizon almost as long as it had taken Mr. Casaubon to become engaged and married. But this learned gentleman was possessed of a fortune. He had assembled his voluminous notes, and had made that sort of reputation which precedes performance, often the larger part of a man's fame. He took a wife, as we have seen, to adorn the remaining quadrant of his course, and be a little moon that would cause hardly a calculable perturbation. But Lydgate was young, poor, ambitious. He had his half-century before him instead of behind him, and he had come to Middlemarch bent on doing many things that were not directly fitted to make his fortune, or even secure him a good income. To a man under such circumstances, taking a wife is something more than a question of adornment, however highly he may rate this, and Lydgate was disposed to give it the first place among wifely functions. To his taste, guided by a single conversation, here was the point on which Miss Brooke would be found wanting, notwithstanding her undeniable beauty. She did not look at things from the proper feminine angle. The society of such women was about as relaxing as going from your work to teach the second form, instead of reclining in a paradise with sweet laughs for bird-notes, and blue eyes for a heaven. Certainly nothing at present could seem much less important to Lydgate than the turn of Miss Brooke's mind, or to Miss Brooke than the qualities of the woman who had attracted this young surgeon. But anyone watching keenly the stealthy convergence of human lots sees a slow preparation of effects from one life on another, which tells like a calculated irony on the indifference or the frozen stare with which we look at our unintroduced neighbour. Destiny stands by sarcastic, with our dramatis personae folded in her hand. Old provincial society had its share of this subtle movement, had not only its striking downfalls, its brilliant young professional dandies, who ended by living up an entry with a drab and 6 children for their establishment, but also those less marked vicissitudes which are constantly shifting the boundaries of social intercourse, and begetting new consciousness of interdependence. Some slipped a little downward, some got higher footing. People denied aspirates, gained wealth, and fastidious gentlemen stood for boroughs. Some were caught in political currents, some in ecclesiastical, and perhaps found themselves surprisingly grouped in consequence, while a few personages or families that stood with rocky firmness amid all this fluctuation were slowly presenting new aspects in spite of solidity, and altering with the double change of self and beholder. Municipal town and rural parish gradually made fresh threads of connection, gradually, as the old stocking gave way to the savings bank, and the worship of the solar guinea became extinct, while squires and baronets, and even lords who had once lived blamelessly afar from the civic mind, gathered the faultiness of closer acquaintanceship. Settlers, too, came from distant counties, some with an alarming novelty of skill, others with an offensive advantage in cunning. In fact, much the same sort of movement and mixture went on in Old England as we find in older Herodotus, who also, in telling what had been, thought it well to take a woman's lot for his starting point, though Io, as a maiden apparently beguiled by attractive merchandise, was the reverse of Miss Brooke, and in this respect perhaps bore more resemblance to Rosamond Vincy, who had excellent taste in costume, with that nymph-like figure and pure blindness which give the largest range to choice in the flow and colour of drapery. But these things made only part of her charm. She was admitted to be the flower of Mrs. Lemon's school, the chief school in the county, where the teaching included all that was demanded in the accomplished female, even to extras, such as the getting in and out of a carriage. Mrs. Lemon herself had always held up Miss Vincey as an example. No pupil, she said, exceeded that young lady for mental acquisition and propriety of speech, while her musical execution was quite exceptional. We cannot help the way in which people speak of us, and probably if Mrs. Lemon had undertaken to describe Juliet or Imogen, these heroines would not have seemed poetical. The first vision of Rosamond would have been enough with most judges to dispel any prejudice excited by Mrs. Lemon's praise. Lydgate could not be long in Middlemarch without having that agreeable vision, or even without making the acquaintance of the Vincey family; for though Mr. Peacock, whose practice he had paid something to enter on, had not been their doctor, Mrs. Vincey not liking the lowering system adopted by him, he had many patients among their connections and acquaintances. For who of any consequence in Middlemarch was not connected, or at least acquainted with the Vinceys? They were old manufacturers, and had kept a good house for 3 generations, in which there had naturally been much intermarrying with neighbours more or less decidedly genteel. Mr. Vincey's sister had made a wealthy match in accepting Mr. Bulstrode, who, however, as a man not born in the town, and altogether of dimly known origin, was considered to have done well in uniting himself with a real Middlemarch family. On the other hand, Mr. Vincey had descended a little, having taken an innkeeper's daughter. But on this side, too, there was a cheering sense of money, for Mrs. Vincey's sister had been second wife to rich old Mr. Featherstone, and had died childless years ago, so that her nephews and nieces might be supposed to touch the affections of the widower. And it happened that Mr. Bulstrode and Mr. Featherstone, 2 of Peacock's most important patients, had, from different causes, given an especially good reception to his successor, who had raised some partisanship as well as discussion. Mr. Wrench, medical attendant to the Vincey family, very early had grounds for thinking lightly of Lydgate's professional discretion, and there was no report about him which was not retailed at the Vinceys', where visitors were frequent. Mr. Vincey was more inclined to general good fellowship than to taking sides, but there was no need for him to be hasty in making any new man acquaintance. Rosamond silently wished that her father would invite Mr. Lydgate. She was tired of the faces and figures she had always been used to, the various irregular profiles and gaits and turns of phrase distinguishing those Middlemarch young men whom she had known as boys. She had been at school with girls of higher position, whose brothers, she had felt sure, it would have been possible for her to be more interested in than in these inevitable Middlemarch companions. But she would not have chosen to mention her wish to her father, and he, for his part, was in no hurry on the subject. An alderman about to be mayor must by and by enlarge his dinner parties, but at present there were plenty of guests at his well-spread table. That table often remained covered with the relics of the family breakfast long after Mr. Vincey had gone with his second son to the warehouse, and when Miss Morgan was already far on in morning lessons with the younger girls in the schoolroom. It awaited the family laggard, who found any sort of inconvenience, to others, less disagreeable than getting up when he was called. This was the case one morning of the October in which we have lately seen Mr. Casaubon visiting the Grange, and though the room was a little overheated with the fire, which had sent the spaniel panting to a remote corner, Rosamond, for some reason, continued to sit at her embroidery longer than usual, now and then giving herself a little shake, and laying her work on her knee to contemplate it, with an air of hesitating weariness. Her mamma, who had returned from an excursion to the kitchen, sat on the other side of the small work-table, with an air of more entire placidity, until, the clock again giving notice that it was going to strike, she looked up from the lace-mending which was occupying her plump fingers, and rang the bell. "Knock at Mr. Fred's door again, Pritchard, and tell him it has struck 10:30. This was said without any change in the radiant good humour of Mrs. Vincey's face, in which 45 years had delved neither angles nor parallels, and pushing back her pink cap-strings, she let her work rest on her lap while she looked admiringly at her daughter. "Mamma," said Rosamond, "when Fred comes down, I wish you would not let him have red herrings. I cannot bear the smell of them all over the house at this hour of the morning." "Oh, my dear, you are so hard on your brothers. It is the only fault I have to find with you. You are the sweetest temper in the world, but you are so tetchy with your brothers." "Not tetchy, mamma. You never hear me speak in an unladylike way." "Well, but you want to deny them things." "Brothers are so unpleasant." "Oh, my dear, you must allow for young men. Be thankful if they have good hearts. A woman must learn to put up with little things. You will be married some day." "Not to anyone who is like Fred." Don't decry your own brother, my dear. Few young men have less against them, although he couldn't take his degree. I'm sure I can't understand why, for he seems to me most clever. And you know yourself he was thought equal to the best society at college. So particular as you are, my dear, I wonder you are not glad to have such a gentlemanly young man for a brother. You are always finding fault with Bob because he is not Fred." "Oh no, mamma, only because he is Bob." "Well, my dear, you will not find any Middlemarch young man who has not something against him." "But—" Here Rosamond's face broke into a smile, which suddenly revealed two dimples. She herself thought unfavourably of these dimples, and smiled little in general society. "But I shall not marry any Middlemarch young man." "So it seems, my love, for you have as good as refused the pick of them, and if there is better to be had, I'm sure there's no girl better deserves it." "Excuse me, mamma, I wish you would not say the pick of them." "Why? What else are they?" "I mean, mamma, it is rather a vulgar expression." "Very likely, my dear. I never was a good speaker. What should I say?" "The best of them." "Why, that seems just as plain and common. If I had had time to think, I should have said, the most superior young men. But with your education you must know." "What must Rosie know, mother?" said Mr. Fred, who had slid in unobserved through the half-open door while the ladies were bending over their work, and now, going up to the fire, stood with his back towards it, warming the soles of his slippers. "Whether it's right to say superior young men," said Mrs. Vincey, ringing the bell. "Oh, there are so many superior teas and sugars now. Superior is getting to be shopkeeper's slang." "Are you beginning to dislike slang, then?" said Rosamond, with mild gravity. "Only the wrong sort. All choice of words is slang. It marks a class." "There is correct English. That is not slang." "I beg your pardon. Correct English is the slang of prigs who write history and essays, and the strongest slang of all is the slang of poets." "Oh, you will say anything, Fred, to gain your point." "Well, tell me whether it is slang or poetry to call an ox a leg-plater." "Of course, you can call it poetry if you like." "Ah, Miss Rosie, you don't know Homer from slang. I shall invent a new game. I shall write bits of slang and poetry on slips, and give them to you to separate." "Dear me, how amusing it is to hear young people talk," said Mrs. Vincey, with cheerful admiration. "Have you got nothing else for my breakfast, Pritchard?" said Fred, to the servant who brought in coffee and buttered toast, while he walked round the table surveying the ham, potted beef, and other cold remnants, with an air of silent rejection and polite forbearance from signs of disgust. "Should you like eggs, sir?" "Eggs? No. Bring me a grilled bone." "Really, Fred," said Rosamond, when the servant had left the room, "if you must have hot things for breakfast, I wish you would come down earlier. You can get up at 6 o'clock to go out hunting." "I cannot understand why you find it so difficult to get up on other mornings." "That is your want of understanding, Rosie. I can get up to go hunting because I like it." "What would you think of me if I came down 2 hours after everyone else, and ordered grilled bone?" "I should think you were an uncommonly fast young lady," said Fred, eating his toast with the utmost composure. "I cannot see why brothers are to make themselves disagreeable any more than sisters." "I don't make myself disagreeable. It is you who find me so. Disagreeable is a word that describes your feelings and not my actions." "I think it describes the smell of grilled bone." "Not at all. It describes a sensation in your little nose associated with certain finicking notions which are the classics of Mrs. Lemon's school. Look at my mother. You don't see her objecting to everything except what she does herself. She is my notion of a pleasant woman." "Bless you both, my dears, and don't quarrel," said Mrs. Vincey, with motherly cordiality. "Come, Fred, tell us all about the new doctor. How is your uncle pleased with him?" "Pretty well, I think. He asks Lydgate all sorts of questions, and then screws up his face while he hears the answers, as if they were pinching his toes. That's his way. Ah, here comes my grilled bone." "But how came you to stay out so late, my dear? You only said you were going to your uncle's." "Oh, I dined at Plymdale's. We had whist. Lydgate was there too." "And what do you think of him? He is very gentlemanly, I suppose. They say he is of excellent family, his relations quite county people." "Yes," said Fred. "There was a Lydgate at John's who spent no end of money. I find this man is a second cousin of his, but rich men may have very poor devils for second cousins." "It always makes a difference, though, to be of good family," said Rosamond, with a tone of decision which showed that she had thought on this subject. Rosamond felt that she might have been happier if she had not been the daughter of a Middlemarch manufacturer. She disliked anything which reminded her that her mother's father had been an innkeeper. Certainly anyone remembering the fact might think that Mrs. Vincey had the air of a very handsome, good-humoured landlady, accustomed to the most capricious orders of gentlemen. "I thought it was odd his name was Tertius," said the bright-faced matron. "But of course it's a name in the family. But now tell us exactly what sort of man he is." "Oh, tallish, dark, clever, talks well. Rather a prig, I think." "I never can make out what you mean by a prig," said Rosamond. "A fellow who wants to show that he has opinions." "Why, my dear, doctors must have opinions," said Mrs. Vincey. "What are they there for else?" "Yes, mother, the opinions they are paid for. But a prig is a fellow who is always making you a present of his opinions." "I suppose Mary Garth admires Mr. Lydgate," said Rosamond, not without a touch of innuendo. "Really, I can't say," said Fred, rather glumly, as he left the table and, taking up a novel which he had brought down with him, threw himself into an arm-chair. "If you are jealous of her, go oftener to Stone Court yourself and eclipse her." "I wish you would not be so vulgar, Fred. If you have finished, pray ring the bell." "It is true, though, what your brother says, Rosamond," Mrs. Vincey began when the servant had cleared the table. "It is 1,000 pities that you haven't the patience to go and see your uncle more. So proud of you as he is, and wanted you to live with him. There's no knowing what he might have done for you as well as for Fred. God knows I'm fond of having you at home with me, but I can part with my children for their good, and now it stands to reason that your uncle Featherstone will do something for Mary Garth." "Mary Garth can bear being at Stone Court, because she likes that better than being a governess," said Rosamond, folding up her work. "I would rather not have anything left to me, if I must earn it, by enduring much of my uncle's cough and his ugly relations." "He can't be long for this world, my dear. I wouldn't hasten his end. But what with asthma and that inward complaint, let us hope there is something better for him in another. And I have no ill will towards Mary Garth, but there's justice to be thought of. And Mr. Featherstone's first wife brought him no money, as my sister did. Her nieces and nephews can't have so much claim as my sisters. And I must say I think Mary Garth a dreadful plain girl, more fit for a governess." "Everyone would not agree with you there, mother," said Fred, who seemed to be able to read and listen too. "Well, my dear," said Mrs. Vincey, wheeling skilfully, "if she had some fortune left her, a man marries his wife's relations, and the Garths are so poor, and live in such a small way. But I shall leave you to your studies, my dear, for I must go and do some shopping." "Fred's studies are not very deep," said Rosamond, rising with her mamma. "He is only reading a novel." "Well, well, by and by he'll go to his Latin and things," said Mrs. Vincey soothingly, stroking her son's head. "There's a fire in the smoking-room on purpose. It's your father's wish, you know. Fred, my dear, and I always tell him you will be good, and go to college again to take your degree." Fred drew his mother's hand down to his lips, but said nothing. "I suppose you are not going out riding to-day?" said Rosamond, lingering a little after her mamma was gone. "No. Why?" "Papa says I may have the chestnut to ride now." "You can go with me tomorrow if you like. Only I am going to Stone Court, remember." "I want to ride so much. It is indifferent to me where we go." Rosamond really wished to go to Stone Court, of all other places. "Oh, I say, Rosie," said Fred, as she was passing out of the room, "if you are going to the piano, let me come and play some airs with you." "Pray do not ask me this morning." "Why not this morning?" "Really, Fred, I wish you would leave off playing the flute. A man looks very silly playing the flute, and you play so out of tune." "When next anyone makes love to you, Miss Rosamond, I will tell him how obliging you are." "Why should you expect me to oblige you by hearing you play the flute, any more than I should expect you to oblige me by not playing it?" "And why should you expect me to take you out riding?" This question led to an adjustment, for Rosamond had set her mind on that particular ride. So Fred was gratified with nearly an hour's practice of Ar Hedi Nos, Ye Banks and Braes, and other favourite airs from his instructor on the flute, a wheezy performance, into which he threw much ambition and an irrepressible hopefulness. Chapter 11. Middlemarch, by George Eliot. Chapter 12. He had more tow on his distaff than Gervase knew. Chaucer. The ride to Stone Court, which Fred and Rosamond took the next morning, lay through a pretty bit of midland landscape, almost all meadows and pastures, with hedgerows still allowed to grow in bushy beauty, and to spread out coral fruit for the birds. Little details gave each field a particular physiognomy, dear to the eyes that have looked on them from childhood. The pool in the corner where the grasses were dank, and trees leaned whisperingly. The great oak shadowing a bare place in mid-pasture. The high bank where the ash-trees grew. The sudden slope of the old marl pit, making a red background for the burdock. The huddled roofs and ricks of the homestead without a traceable way of approach. The grey gate and fences against the depths of the bordering wood. And the stray hovel, its old thatch full of mossy hills and valleys, with wondrous modulations of light and shadow, such as we travel far to see in later life, and see larger, but not more beautiful. These are the things that make the gamut of joy in landscape to midland-bred souls, the things they toddled among, or perhaps learned by heart standing between their father's knees while he drove leisurely. But the road, even the by-road, was excellent, for Lowick, as we have seen, was not a parish of muddy lanes and poor tenants, and it was into Lowick parish that Fred and Rosamond entered after a couple of miles' riding. Another mile would bring them to Stone Court, and at the end of the first half the house was already visible, looking as if it had been arrested in its growth toward a stone mansion by an unexpected budding of farm buildings on its left flank, which had hindered it from becoming anything more than the substantial dwelling of a gentleman farmer. It was not the less agreeable an object in the distance for the cluster of pinnacled corn-ricks which balanced the fine row of walnuts on the right. Presently it was possible to discern something that might be a gig on the circular drive before the front door. "Dear me," said Rosamond, "I hope none of my uncle's horrible relations are there." "They are, though. That is Mrs. Wall's gig, the last yellow gig left, I should think. When I see Mrs. Wall in it, I understand how yellow can have been worn for mourning. That gig seems to be more funereal than a hearse. But then Mrs. Wall always has black crape on. How does she manage it, Rosie? Her friends can't always be dying." "I don't know at all, and she is not in the least evangelical," said Rosamond reflectively, as if that religious point of view would have fully accounted for perpetual crape. "And not poor," she added, after a moment's pause. "No, by George. They are as rich as Jews, those Walls and Featherstones. I mean for people like them who don't want to spend anything. And yet they hang about my uncle like vultures, and are afraid of a farthing going away from their side of the family. But I believe he hates them all." The Mrs. Wall who was so far from being admirable in the eyes of these distant connections had happened to say this very morning, not at all with a defiant air, but in a low, muffled, neutral tone, as of a voice heard through cotton wool, that she did not wish to enjoy their good opinion. She was seated, as she observed, on her own brother's hearth, and had been Jane Featherstone 25 years before she had been Jane Wall, which entitled her to speak when her own brother's name had been made free with by those who had no right to it. "What are you driving at there?" said Mr. Featherstone, holding his stick between his knees and settling his wig, while he gave her a momentary sharp glance, which seemed to react on him like a draught of cold air, and set him coughing. Mrs. Wall had to defer her answer till he was quiet again, till Mary Garth had supplied him with fresh syrup, and he had begun to rub the gold knob of his stick, looking bitterly at the fire. It was a bright fire, but it made no difference to the chill-looking purplish tint of Mrs. Wall's face, which was as neutral as her voice, having mere chinks for eyes and lips that hardly moved in speaking. "The doctors can't master that cough, brother. It's just like what I have, for I'm your own sister, constitution and everything. But, as I was saying, it's a pity Mrs. Vincey's family can't be better conducted." "Tchah! You said nothing of the sort. You said somebody had made free with my name." "And no more than can be proved, if what everybody says is true. My brother Solomon tells me it's the talk up and down in Middlemarch how unsteady young Vincy is, and has been for ever gambling at billiards since he came home." "Nonsense! What's a game at billiards? It's a good gentlemanly game, and young Vincy is not a clodhopper. If your son John took to billiards now, he'd make a fool of himself." "Your nephew John never took to billiards or any other game, brother, and is far from losing hundreds of pounds, which, if what everybody says is true, must be found somewhere else than out of Mr. Vincy the father's pocket. For they say he's been losing money for years, though nobody would think so, to see him go coursing and keeping open house as they do. And I've heard say Mr. Bulstrode condemns Mrs. Vincy beyond anything for her flightiness, and spoiling her children so." "What's Mr. Bulstrode to me? I don't bank with him." "Well, Mrs. Bulstrode is Mr. Vincy's own sister, and they do say that Mr. Vincy mostly trades on the bank money, and you may see yourself, brother, when a woman past 40 has pink strings always flying, and that light way of laughing at everything, it's very unbecoming. But indulging your children is one thing, and finding money to pay their debts is another. And it's openly said that young Vincy has raised money on his expectations. I don't say what expectations. Miss Garth hears me, and is welcome to tell again. I know young people hang together." "No, thank you, Mrs. Wall," said Mary Garth. "I dislike hearing scandal too much to wish to repeat it." Mr. Featherstone rubbed the knob of his stick, and made a brief convulsive show of laughter, which had much the same genuineness as an old whist-player's chuckle over a bad hand. Still looking at the fire, he said, "And who pretends to say Fred Vincy hasn't got expectations? Such a fine, spirited fellow is like enough to have 'em." There was a slight pause before Mrs. Wall replied, and when she did so, her voice seemed to be slightly moistened with tears, though her face was still dry. "Whether or no, brother, it is naturally painful to me and my brother Solomon to hear your name made free with, and your complaint being such as may carry you off sudden, and people who are no more Featherstones than the Merry Andrew at the fair, openly reckoning on your property coming to them. And me your own sister, and Solomon your own brother. And if that's to be it, what has it pleased the Almighty to make families for?" Here Mrs. Wall's tears fell, but with moderation. "Come, out with it, Jane," said Mr. Featherstone, looking at her. "You mean to say Fred Vincy has been getting someone to advance him money on what he says he knows about my will, eh?" "I never said so, brother." Mrs. Wall's voice had again become dry and unshaken. "It was told me by my brother Solomon last night when he called, coming from market, to give me advice about the old wheat, me being a widow, and my son John only 23, though steady beyond anything. And he had it from most undeniable authority, and not one, but many." "Stuff and nonsense! I don't believe a word of it. It's all a got-up story. Go to the window, missy. I thought I heard a horse. See if the doctor's coming." "Not got up by me, brother, nor yet by Solomon, who, whatever else he may be, and I don't deny he has oddities, has made his will and parted his property equal between such kin as he's friends with, though for my part I think there are times when some should be considered more than others. But Solomon makes it no secret what he means to do." "The more fool he," said Mr. Featherstone, with some difficulty, breaking into a severe fit of coughing, that required Mary Garth to stand near him, so that she did not find out whose horses they were which presently paused stamping on the gravel before the door. Before Mr. Featherstone's cough was quiet, Rosamond entered, bearing up her riding habit with much grace. She bowed ceremoniously to Mrs. Wall, who said stiffly, "How do you do, miss?" smiled and nodded silently to Mary, and remained standing till the coughing should cease, and allow her uncle to notice her. "Heyday, miss," he said at last. "You have a fine colour. Where's Fred?" "Seeing about the horses. He will be in presently."
Sit down, sit down. Mrs. Wall, you'd better go."
Even those neighbours who had called Peter Featherstone an old fox had never accused him of being insincerely polite, and his sister was quite used to the peculiar absence of ceremony with which he marked his sense of blood relationship. Indeed, she herself was accustomed to think that entire freedom from the necessity of behaving agreeably was included in the Almighty's intentions about families. She rose slowly without any sign of resentment, and said in her usual muffled monotone, "Brother, I hope the new doctor will be able to do something for you. Solomon says there's great talk of his cleverness. I'm sure it's my wish you should be spared. And there's none more ready to nurse you than your own sister, and your own nieces, if you'd only say the word. There's Rebecca and Joanna and Elizabeth, you know."
"Ay, ay, I remember. You'll see I've remembered 'em all dark and ugly." They'd need have some money, eh? There never was any beauty in the women of our family. But the Featherstones have always had some money, and the Walls too. Wall had money too. A warm man was Wall. Ay, ay, money's a good egg, and if you have got money to leave behind you, lay it in a warm nest. Good-bye, Mrs. Wall."
Here Mr. Featherstone pulled at both sides of his wig as if he wanted to deafen himself, and his sister went away ruminating on this oracular speech of his. Notwithstanding her jealousy of the Vinceys and of Mary Garth, there remained as the nethermost sediment in her mental shallows a persuasion that her brother Peter Featherstone could never leave his chief property away from his blood relations. Else why had the Almighty carried off his 2 wives, both childless, after he had gained so much by manganese and things, turning up when nobody expected it? And why was there a Lowick parish church, and the Walls and Powderells all sitting in the same pew for generations, and the Featherstone pew next to them, if, the Sunday after her brother Peter's death, everybody was to know that the property was gone out of the family? The human mind has at no period accepted a moral chaos, and so preposterous a result was not strictly conceivable. But we are frightened at much that is not strictly conceivable. When Fred came in, the old man eyed him with a peculiar twinkle, which the younger had often had reason to interpret as pride in the satisfactory details of his appearance.
"You 2 misses go away," said Mr. Featherstone. "I want to speak to Fred."
"Come into my room, Rosamond. You will not mind the cold for a little while," said Mary. The 2 girls had not only known each other in childhood, but had been at the same provincial school together, Mary as an articled pupil, so that they had many memories in common, and liked very well to talk in private. Indeed, this tete-a-tete was one of Rosamond's objects in coming to Stone Court. Old Featherstone would not begin the dialogue till the door had been closed. He continued to look at Fred with the same twinkle and with one of his habitual grimaces, alternately screwing and widening his mouth, and when he spoke it was in a low tone, which might be taken for that of an informer ready to be bought off, rather than for the tone of an offended senior. He was not a man to feel any strong moral indignation, even on account of trespasses against himself. It was natural that others should want to get an advantage over him, but then he was a little too cunning for them.
"So, sir, you've been paying 10% for money which you've promised to pay off by mortgaging my land when I'm dead and gone, eh? You put my life at a 12-month, say. But I can alter my will yet."
Fred blushed. He had not borrowed money in that way, for excellent reasons, but he was conscious of having spoken with some confidence, perhaps with more than he exactly remembered, about his prospect of getting Featherstone's land as a future means of paying present debts.
"I don't know what you refer to, sir. I have certainly never borrowed any money on such an insecurity. Please to explain." "No, sir, it's you must explain. I can alter my will yet, let me tell you. I'm of sound mind, can reckon compound interest in my head, and remember every fool's name as well as I could 20 years ago. What the deuce? I'm under 80. I say you must contradict this story."
"I have contradicted it, sir," Fred answered, with a touch of impatience, not remembering that his uncle did not verbally discriminate contradicting from disproving, though no one was further from confounding the 2 ideas than old Featherstone, who often wondered that so many fools took his own assertions for proofs. "But I contradict it again. The story is a silly lie."
"Nonsense! You must bring documents. It comes from authority."
"Name the authority, and make him name the man of whom I borrowed the money, and then I can disprove the story."
"It's pretty good authority, I think. A man who knows most of what goes on in Middlemarch. It's that fine, religious, charitable uncle of yours. Come now."
Here Mr. Featherstone had his peculiar inward shake which signified merriment.
"Mr. Bulstrode." "Who else, eh?"
"Then the story has grown into this lie out of some sermonizing words he may have let fall about me. Do they pretend that he named the man who lent me the money?"
"If there is such a man, depend upon it Bulstrode knows him.
But supposing you only tried to get the money lent, and didn't get it, Bulstrode'd know about that too. You bring me a writing from Bulstrode to say he doesn't believe you'd ever promise to pay your debts out of my land. Come now." Mr. Featherstone's face required its whole scale of grimaces as a muscular outlet to his silent triumph in the soundness of his faculties. Fred felt himself to be in a disgusting dilemma. "You must be joking, sir. Mr. Bulstrode, like other men, believes scores of things that are not true, and he has a prejudice against me. I could easily get him to write that he knew no facts in proof of the report you speak of, though it might lead to unpleasantness. But I could hardly ask him to write down what he believes or does not believe about me." Fred paused an instant, and then added, in politic appeal to his uncle's vanity,
"That is hardly a thing for a gentleman to ask."
But he was disappointed in the result.
"Ay, I know what you mean. You'd sooner offend me than Bulstrode. And what's he? He's got no land hereabout that ever I heard tell of. A speculating fellow. He may come down any day when the devil leaves off backing him. And that's what his religion means. He wants God A'mighty to come in. That's nonsense. There's one thing I made out pretty clear when I used to go to church, and it's this: God A'mighty sticks to the land. He promises land, and he gives land, and he makes chaps rich with corn and cattle. But you take the other side. You like Bulstrode and speculation better than Featherstone and land."
"I beg your pardon, sir," said Fred, rising, standing with his back to the fire and beating his boot with his whip. "I like neither Bulstrode nor speculation." He spoke rather sulkily, feeling himself stalemated.
"Well, well, you can do without me, that's pretty clear," said old Featherstone, secretly disliking the possibility that Fred would show himself at all independent. "You neither want a bit of land to make a squire of you instead of a starving person, nor a lift of £100 by the way. It's all one to me. I can make 5 codicils if I like, and I shall keep my bank-notes for a nest egg. It's all one to me."
Fred coloured again. Featherstone had rarely given him presents of money, and at this moment it seemed almost harder to part with the immediate prospect of bank-notes than with the more distant prospect of the land. "I am not ungrateful, sir. I never meant to show disregard for any kind intentions you might have towards me. On the contrary."
"Very good. Then prove it. You bring me a letter from Bulstrode saying he doesn't believe you've been cracking and promising to pay your debts out of my land, and then, if there's any scrape you've got into, we'll see if I can't back you a bit. Come now, that's a bargain. Here, give me your arm. I'll try and walk round the room."
Fred, in spite of his irritation, had kindness enough in him to be a little sorry for the unloved, unvenerated old man, who with his dropsical legs looked more than usually pitiable in walking. While giving his arm, he thought that he should not himself like to be an old fellow with his constitution breaking up, and he waited good-temperedly, first before the window to hear the wonted remarks about the guinea-fowls and the weathercock, and then before the scanty bookshelves, of which the chief glories in dark calf were Josephus, Culpepper, Klopstock's Messiah, and several volumes of the Gentleman's Magazine.
"Read me the name of the books. Come now, you're a college man."
Fred gave him the titles.
"What did Missy want with more books? What must you be bringing her more books for?"
"They amuse her, sir. She is very fond of reading."
"A little too fond," said Mr. Featherstone captiously. "She was for reading when she sat with me, but I put a stop to that. She's got the newspaper to read out loud. That's enough for one day, I should think. I can't abide to see her reading to herself. You mind and not bring her any more books, do you hear?"
"Yes, sir, I hear." Fred had received this order before, and had secretly disobeyed it. He intended to disobey it again.
"Ring the bell," said Mr. Featherstone. "I want Missy to come down."
Rosamond and Mary had been talking faster than their male friends. They did not think of sitting down, but stood at the toilet-table near the window while Rosamond took off her hat, adjusted her veil, and applied little touches of her finger-tips to her hair of infantine fairness, neither flaxen nor yellow. Mary Garth seemed all the plainer standing at an angle between the two nymphs, the one in the glass and the one out of it, who looked at each other with eyes of heavenly blue, deep enough to hold the most exquisite meanings an ingenious beholder could put into them, and deep enough to hide the meanings of the owner if these should happen to be less exquisite. Only a few children in Middlemarch looked blonde by the side of Rosamond, and the slim figure displayed by her riding habit had delicate undulations. In fact, most men in Middlemarch, except her brothers, held that Miss Vincey was the best girl in the world, and some called her an angel. Mary Garth, on the contrary, had the aspect of an ordinary sinner. She was brown, her curly dark hair was rough and stubborn, her stature was low, and it would not be true to declare, in satisfactory antithesis, that she had all the virtues. Plainness has its peculiar temptations and vices quite as much as beauty. It is apt either to feign amiability, or, not feigning it, to show all the repulsiveness of discontent. At any rate, to be called an ugly thing in contrast with that lovely creature your companion, is apt to produce some effect beyond a sense of fine veracity and fitness in the phrase. At the age of 22, Mary had certainly not attained that perfect good sense and good principle which are usually recommended to the less fortunate girl,
as if they were to be obtained in quantities ready mixed, with a flavour of resignation as required. Her shrewdness had a streak of satiric bitterness continually renewed and never carried utterly out of sight, except by a strong current of gratitude toward those who, instead of telling her that she ought to be contented, did something to make her so. Advancing womanhood had tempered her plainness, which was of a good human sort, such as the mothers of our race have very commonly worn in all latitudes, under a more or less becoming headgear. Rembrandt would have painted her with pleasure, and would have made her broad features look out of the canvas with intelligent honesty. For honesty, truth-telling fairness, was Mary's reigning virtue. She neither tried to create illusions, nor indulged in them for her own behoof, and when she was in a good mood she had humour enough in her to laugh at herself. When she and Rosamond happened both to be reflected in the glass, she said laughingly, "What a brown patch I am by the side of you, Rosie! You are the most unbecoming companion." "Oh, no. No one thinks of your appearance. You are so sensible and useful, Mary. Beauty is of very little consequence in reality," said Rosamond, turning her head towards Mary, but with eyes swerving towards the new view of her neck in the glass. "You mean my beauty," said Mary rather sardonically. Rosamond thought, "Poor Mary, she takes the kindest things ill." Aloud she said, "What have you been doing lately?" "I? Oh, minding the house, pouring out syrup, pretending to be amiable and contented, learning to have a bad opinion of everybody." "It is a wretched life for you." "No," said Mary curtly, with a little toss of her head. "I think my life is pleasanter than your Miss Morgan's." "Yes, but Miss Morgan is so uninteresting, and not young." "She is interesting to herself, I suppose, and I am not at all sure that everything gets easier as one gets older." "No," said Rosamond reflectively. "One wonders what such people do without any prospect. To be sure, there is religion as a support. But," she added, dimpling, "it is very different with you, Mary. You may have an offer." "Has anyone told you he means to make me one?" "Of course not. I mean there is a gentleman who may fall in love with you, seeing you almost every day." A certain change in Mary's face was chiefly determined by the resolve not to show any change. "Does that always make people fall in love?" she answered carelessly. "It seems to me quite as often a reason for detesting each other." "Not when they are interesting and agreeable. I hear that Mr. Lydgate is both." "Oh, Mr. Lydgate," said Mary with an unmistakable lapse into indifference. "You want to know something about him," she added, not choosing to indulge Rosamond's indirectness. "Merely how you like him." "There is no question of liking at present. My liking always wants some little kindness to kindle it. I am not magnanimous enough to like people who speak to me without seeming to see me." "Is he so haughty?" said Rosamond, with heightened satisfaction. "You know that he is of good family." "No, he did not give that as a reason." "Mary, you are the oddest girl. But what sort of looking man is he? Describe him to me." "How can one describe a man? I can give you an inventory. Heavy eyebrows, dark eyes, a straight nose, thick dark hair, large solid white hands, and, let me see, oh, an exquisite cambric pocket handkerchief. But you will see him. You know this is about the time of his visits." Rosamond blushed a little, but said meditatively, "I rather like a haughty manner. I cannot endure a rattling young man." "I did not tell you that Mr. Lydgate was haughty. But il y en a pour tous les goûts, as little Mamselle used to say, and if any girl can choose the particular sort of conceit she would like, I should think it is you, Rosie." "Haughtiness is not conceit. I call Fred conceited." "I wish no one said any worse of him. He should be more careful. Mrs. Wall has been telling uncle that Fred is very unsteady." Mary spoke from a girlish impulse which got the better of her judgment. There was a vague uneasiness associated with the word unsteady, which she hoped Rosamond might say something to dissipate. But she purposely abstained from mentioning Mrs. Wall's more special insinuation. "Oh, Fred is horrid," said Rosamond. She would not have allowed herself so unsuitable a word to any one but Mary. "What do you mean by horrid?" "He is so idle, and makes papa so angry, and says he will not take orders." "I think Fred is quite right." "How can you say he is quite right, Mary? I thought you had more sense of religion." "He is not fit to be a clergyman."
But he ought to be fit.
Well, then, he is not what he ought to be. I know some other people who are in the same case.
But no one approves of them. I should not like to marry a clergyman, but there must be clergymen.
It does not follow that Fred must be one.
But when papa has been at the expense of educating him for it, and only suppose if he should have no fortune left him.
I can suppose that very well, said Mary dryly.
Then I wonder you can defend Fred, said Rosamond, inclined to push this point.
I don't defend him, said Mary, laughing. I would defend any parish from having him for a clergyman.
But of course if he were a clergyman he must be different.
Yes, he would be a great hypocrite, and he is not that yet.
Oh, it is of no use saying anything to you, Mary. You always take Fred's part.
Why should I not take his part? Said Mary, lighting up. He would take mine. He is the only person who takes the least trouble to oblige me.
You make me feel very uncomfortable, Mary, said Rosamond with her gravest mildness. I would not tell mamma for the world.
What would you not tell her? Said Mary angrily.
Pray do not go into a rage, Mary, said Rosamond mildly as ever.
If your mamma is afraid that Fred will make me an offer, tell her that I would not marry him if he asked me. But he is not going to do so, that I am aware. He certainly never has asked me.
Mary, you are always so violent.
And you are always so exasperating.
I? What can you blame me for?
Oh, blameless people are always the most exasperating.
Oh, there is the bell. I think we must go down. I did not mean to quarrel, said Rosamond, putting on her hat.
Quarrel? Nonsense, we have not quarrelled. If one is not to get into a rage sometimes, what is the good of being friends?
Am I to repeat what you have said?
Just as you please. I never say what I am afraid of having repeated. But let us go down. Mr. Lydgate was rather late this morning, but the visitors stayed long enough to see him, for Mr. Featherstone asked Rosamond to sing to him, and she herself was so kind as to propose a second favourite song of his, Flow on, thou shining river, after she had sung Home, Sweet Home, which she detested. This hard-headed old overreach approved of the sentimental song as a suitable garnish for girls, and also as fundamentally fine, sentiment being the right thing for a song. Mr. Featherstone was still applauding the last performance, and assuring Missy that her voice was as clear as a blackbird's, when Mr. Lydgate's horse passed the window. His dull expectation of the usual disagreeable routine with an aged patient, who can hardly believe that medicine would not set him up if the doctor were only clever enough, added to his general disbelief in Middlemarch charms, made a doubly effective background to this vision of Rosamond, whom old Featherstone made haste ostentatiously to introduce as his niece, though he had never thought it worth while to speak of Mary Garth in that light. Nothing escaped Lydgate in Rosamond's graceful behaviour. How delicately she waived the notice which the old man's want of taste had thrust upon her by a quiet gravity, not showing her dimples on the wrong occasion, but showing them afterwards in speaking to Mary, to whom she addressed herself with so much good-natured interest, that Lydgate, after quickly examining Mary more fully than he had done before, saw an adorable kindness in Rosamond's eyes. But Mary from some cause looked rather out of temper. "Miss Rosie has been singing me a song. You've nothing to say against that, eh, doctor?" said Mr. Featherstone. "I like it better than your physic."
"That has made me forget how the time was going," said Rosamond, rising to reach her hat, which she had laid aside before singing, so that her flower-like head on its white stem was seen in perfection above her riding habit. "Fred, we really must go."
"Very good," said Fred, who had his own reasons for not being in the best spirits, and wanted to get away. "Miss Vincy is a musician," said Lydgate, following her with his eyes. Every nerve and muscle in Rosamond was adjusted to the consciousness that she was being looked at. She was by nature an actress of parts that entered into her physique. She even acted her own character, and so well that she did not know it to be precisely her own. "The best in Middlemarch, I'll be bound," said Mr. Featherstone. "Let the next be who she will. Eh, Fred? Speak up for your sister." "I'm afraid I'm out of court, sir. My evidence would be good for nothing."
"Middlemarch has not a very high standard, uncle," said Rosamond, with a pretty lightness, going towards her whip, which lay at a distance. Lydgate was quick in anticipating her. He reached the whip before she did, and turned to present it to her. She bowed and looked at him. He, of course, was looking at her, and their eyes met with that peculiar meeting which is never arrived at by effort, but seems like a sudden divine clearance of haze.
I think Lydgate turned a little paler than usual, but Rosamond blushed deeply, and felt a certain astonishment. After that she was really anxious to go, and did not know what sort of stupidity her uncle was talking of when she went to shake hands with him. Yet this result, which she took to be a mutual impression, called falling in love, was just what Rosamond had contemplated beforehand. Ever since that important new arrival in Middlemarch she had woven a little future, of which something like this scene was the necessary beginning. Strangers, whether wrecked and clinging to a raft, or duly escorted and accompanied by portmanteaus, have always had a circumstantial fascination for the virgin mind, against which native merit has urged itself in vain. And a stranger was absolutely necessary to Rosamond's social romance, which had always turned on a lover and bridegroom who was not a Middlemarcher, and who had no connections at all like her own. Of late, indeed, the construction seemed to demand that he should somehow be related to a baronet. Now that she and the stranger had met, reality proved much more moving than anticipation, and Rosamond could not doubt that this was the great epoch of her life. She judged of her own symptoms as those of awakening love, and she held it still more natural that Mr. Lydgate should have fallen in love at first sight of her. These things happened so often at balls, and why not by the morning light, when the complexion showed all the better for it? Rosamond, though no older than Mary, was rather used to being fallen in love with, but she, for her part, had remained indifferent and fastidiously critical towards both fresh sprig and faded bachelor. And here was Mr. Lydgate suddenly corresponding to her ideal, being altogether foreign to Middlemarch, carrying a certain air of distinction congruous with good family, and possessing connections which offered vistas of that middle-class heaven, rank. A man of talent also, whom it would be especially delightful to enslave. In fact, a man who had touched her nature quite newly, and brought a vivid interest into her life which was better than any fancied might be, such as she was in the habit of opposing to the actual. Thus, in riding home, both the brother and the sister were preoccupied and inclined to be silent. Rosamond, whose basis for her structure had the usual airy slightness, was of remarkably detailed and realistic imagination when the foundation had once been presupposed, and before they had ridden a mile she was far on in the costume and introductions of her wedded life, having determined on her house in Middlemarch, and foreseen the visits she would pay to her husband's high-bred relatives at a distance, whose finished manners she could appropriate as thoroughly as she had done her school accomplishments, preparing herself thus for vaguer elevations which might ultimately come. There was nothing financial, still less sordid, in her provisions. She cared about what were considered refinements, and not about the money that was to pay for them. Fred's mind, on the other hand, was busy with an anxiety which even his ready hopefulness could not immediately quell. He saw no way of eluding Featherstone's stupid demand without incurring consequences which he liked less even than the task of fulfilling it. His father was already out of humour with him, and would be still more so if he were the occasion of any additional coolness between his own family and the Bulstrodes. Then he himself hated having to go and speak to his uncle Bulstrode, and perhaps after drinking wine he had said many foolish things about Featherstone's property, and these had been magnified by report. Fred felt that he made a wretched figure as a fellow who bragged about expectations from a queer old miser like Featherstone, and went to beg for certificates at his bidding. But those expectations! He really had them, and he saw no agreeable alternative if he gave them up. Besides, he had lately made a debt which galled him extremely, and old Featherstone had almost bargained to pay it off. The whole affair was miserably small. His debts were small, even his expectations were not anything so very magnificent. Fred had known men to whom he would have been ashamed of confessing the smallness of his scrapes. Such ruminations naturally produced a streak of misanthropic bitterness. To be born the son of a Middlemarch manufacturer, and inevitable heir to nothing in particular, while such men as Mainwaring and Vian, certainly life was a poor business when a spirited young fellow, with a good appetite for the best of everything, had so poor an outlook. It had not occurred to Fred that the introduction of Bulstrode's name in the matter was a fiction of old Featherstone's, nor could this have made any difference to his position. He saw plainly enough that the old man wanted to exercise his power by tormenting him a little, and also probably to get some satisfaction out of seeing him on unpleasant terms with Bulstrode. Fred fancied that he saw to the bottom of his uncle Featherstone's soul, though in reality half what he saw there was no more than the reflex of his own inclinations. The difficult task of knowing another soul is not for young gentlemen, whose consciousness is chiefly made up of their own wishes. Fred's main point of debate with himself was, whether he should tell his father,
or try to get through the affair without his father's knowledge. It was probably Mrs. Wall who had been talking about him, and if Mary Garth had repeated Mrs. Wall's report to Rosamond, it would be sure to reach his father, who would as surely question him about it. He said to Rosamond as they slackened their pace, "Rosie, did Mary tell you that Mrs. Wall had said anything about me?" "Yes, indeed, she did." "What?" "That you were very unsteady." "Was that all?" "I should think that was enough, Fred." "You are sure she said no more?" "Mary mentioned nothing else. But really, Fred, I think you ought to be ashamed." "Oh, fudge! Don't lecture me. What did Mary say about it?" "I am not obliged to tell you. You care so very much what Mary says, and you are too rude to allow me to speak." "Of course I care what Mary says. She is the best girl I know." "I should never have thought she was a girl to fall in love with." "How do you know what men would fall in love with? Girls never know." "At least, Fred, let me advise you not to fall in love with her, for she says she would not marry you if you asked her." "She might have waited till I did ask her." "I knew it would nettle you, Fred." "Not at all. She would not have said so if you had not provoked her." Before reaching home, Fred concluded that he would tell the whole affair as simply as possible to his father, who might perhaps take on himself the unpleasant business of speaking to Bulstrode. End of Chapter 12. End of Book 1.
Chapter 13. First Gent. How class your man? As better than the most, or seeming better, worse beneath that cloak, as saint or knave, pilgrim or hypocrite? Second Gent. Nay, tell me how you class your wealth of books, the drifted relics of all time, as well sort them at once by size and livery. Vellum, tall copies, and the common calf, will hardly cover more diversity than all your labels cunningly devised to class your unread authors. In consequence of what he had heard from Fred, Mr. Vincey determined to speak with Mr. Bulstrode in his private room at the bank at 1:30, when he was usually free from other callers. But a visitor had come in at 1 o'clock, and Mr. Bulstrode had so much to say to him that there was little chance of the interview being over in half an hour. The banker's speech was fluent, but it was also copious, and he used up an appreciable amount of time in brief, meditative pauses. Do not imagine his sickly aspect to have been of the yellow, black-haired sort. He had a pale, blond skin, thin grey, besprinkled brown hair, light grey eyes, and a large forehead. Loud men called his subdued tone an undertone, and sometimes implied that it was inconsistent with openness, though there seems to be no reason why a loud man should not be given to concealment of anything except his own voice, unless it can be shown that Holy Writ has placed the seat of candour in the lungs. Mr. Bulstrode had also a deferential bending attitude in listening, and an apparently fixed attentiveness in his eyes, which made those persons who thought themselves worth hearing infer that he was seeking the utmost improvement from their discourse. Others, who expected to make no great figure, disliked this kind of moral lantern turned on them. If you are not proud of your cellar, there is no thrill of satisfaction in seeing your guest hold up his wine glass to the light and look judicial. Such joys are reserved for conscious merit. Hence Mr. Bulstrode's close attention was not agreeable to the publicans and sinners in Middlemarch. It was attributed by some to his being a Pharisee, and by others to his being evangelical. Less superficial reasoners among them wished to know who his father and grandfather were, observing that 25 years ago nobody had ever heard of a Bulstrode in Middlemarch. To his present visitor, Lydgate, the scrutinizing look was a matter of indifference. He simply formed an unfavourable opinion of the banker's constitution, and concluded that he had an eager inward life, with little enjoyment of tangible things. "I shall be exceedingly obliged if you will look in on me here occasionally, Mr. Lydgate," the banker observed, after a brief pause, "if, as I dare to hope, I have the privilege of finding you a valuable coadjutor in the interesting matter of hospital management. There will be many questions which we shall need to discuss in private. As to the new hospital, which is nearly finished, I shall consider what you have said about the advantages of the special destination for fevers. The decision will rest with me, for though Lord Medlicott has given the land and timber for the building, he is not disposed to give his personal attention to the object. "There are few things better worth the pains in a provincial town like this," said Lydgate. "A fine fever hospital, in addition to the old infirmary, might be the nucleus of a medical school here, when once we get our medical reforms. And what would do more for medical education than the spread of such schools over the country? A born provincial man, who has a grain of public spirit as well as a few ideas, should do what he can to resist the rush of everything that is a little better than common towards London. Any valid professional aims may often find a freer, if not a richer field in the provinces." One of Lydgate's gifts was a voice habitually deep and sonorous, yet capable of becoming very low and gentle at the right moment. About his ordinary bearing there was a certain fling, a fearless expectation of success, a confidence in his own powers, and integrity much fortified by contempt for petty obstacles or seductions of which he had no experience. But this proud openness was made lovable by an expression of unaffected goodwill. Mr. Bulstrode perhaps liked him the better for the difference between them in pitch and manners. He certainly liked him the better, as Rosamond did, for being a stranger in Middlemarch. One can begin so many things with a new person, even begin to be a better man. "I shall rejoice to furnish your zeal with fuller opportunities," Mr. Bulstrode answered. "I mean by confiding to you the superintendence of my new hospital, should a mature knowledge favour that issue. For I am determined that so great an object shall not be shackled by our two physicians. Indeed, I am encouraged to consider your advent in this town as a gracious indication that a more manifest blessing is now to be awarded to my efforts, which have hitherto been much withstood. With regard to the old infirmary, we have gained the initial point, I mean your election, and now I hope you will not shrink from incurring a certain amount of jealousy and dislike from your professional brethren by presenting yourself as a reformer." "I will not profess bravery," said Lydgate, smiling, "but I acknowledge a good deal of pleasure in fighting, and I should not care for my profession if I did not believe that better methods were to be found and enforced there as well as everywhere else." "The standard of that profession is low in Middlemarch, my dear sir," said the banker. "I mean in knowledge and skill, not in social status, for our medical men are most of them connected with respectable townspeople here. My own imperfect health has induced me to give some attention to those palliative resources which the Divine Mercy has placed within our reach. I have consulted eminent men in the metropolis, and I am painfully aware of the backwardness under which medical treatment labours in our provincial districts. Yes, with our present medical rules and education, one must be satisfied now and then to meet with a fair practitioner. As to the higher questions which determine the starting point of a diagnosis, as to the philosophy of medical evidence, any glimmering of these can only come from a scientific culture, of which country practitioners have usually no more notion than the man in the moon." Mr. Bulstrode, bending and looking intently, found the form which Lydgate had given to his agreement not quite suited to his comprehension. Under such circumstances a judicious man changes the topic, and enters on ground where his own gifts may be more useful. "I am aware," he said, "that the peculiar bias of medical ability is towards material means. Nevertheless, Mr. Lydgate, I hope we shall not vary in sentiment as to a measure in which you are not likely to be actively concerned, but in which your sympathetic concurrence may be an aid to me. You recognize, I hope, the existence of spiritual interests in your patients?" "Certainly I do. But those words are apt to cover different meanings to different minds." "Precisely. And on such subjects wrong teaching is as fatal as no teaching. Now, a point which I have much at heart to secure is a new regulation as to clerical attendance at the old infirmary. The building stands in Mr. Fairbrother's parish. You know Mr. Fairbrother?" "I have seen him. He gave me his vote. I must call to thank him. He seems a very bright, pleasant little fellow, and I understand he is a naturalist." "Mr. Fairbrother, my dear sir, is a man deeply painful to contemplate. I suppose there is not a clergyman in this country who has greater talents." Mr. Bulstrode paused and looked meditative. "I have not yet been pained by finding any excessive talent in Middlemarch," said Lydgate bluntly. What I desire," Mr. Bulstrode continued, looking still more serious, "is that Mr. Fairbrother's attendance at the hospital should be superseded by the appointment of a chaplain of Mr. Tyke, in fact and that no other spiritual aid should be called in. As a medical man I could have no opinion on such point unless I knew Mr. Tyke, and even then I should require to know the cases in which he was applied." Lydgate smiled, but he was bent on being circumspect. "Of course you cannot enter fully into the merits of this measure at present, but here Mr. Bulstrode began to speak with a more chiselled emphasis, the subject is likely to be referred to the medical board of the infirmary, and what I trust I may ask of you is, that in virtue of the cooperation between us which I now look forward to, you will not, so far as you are concerned, be influenced by my opponents in this matter." "I hope I shall have nothing to do with clerical disputes," said Lydgate. "The path I have chosen is to work well in my own profession." "My responsibility, Mr. Lydgate, is of a broader kind. With me, indeed, this question is one of sacred accountableness, whereas with my opponents I have good reason to say that it is an occasion for gratifying a spirit of worldly opposition. But I shall not therefore drop one iota of my convictions, or cease to identify myself with the truth which an evil generation hates. I have devoted myself to this object of hospital improvement, but I will boldly confess to you, Mr. Lydgate, that I should have no interest in hospitals if I believed that nothing more was concerned therein than the cure of mortal diseases. I have another ground of action, and in the face of persecution I will not conceal it." Mr. Bulstrode's voice had become a loud and agitated whisper as he said the last words. "There we certainly differ," said Lydgate, but he was not sorry that the door was now opened and Mr. Vincey was announced. That florid, sociable personage was become more interesting to him since he had seen Rosamond. Not that, like her, he had been weaving any future in which their lots were united, but a man naturally remembers a charming girl with pleasure, and is willing to dine where he may see her again. Before he took leave, Mr. Vincey had given that invitation which he had been in no hurry about, for Rosamond at breakfast had mentioned that she thought her uncle Featherstone had taken the new doctor into great favour. Mr. Bulstrode, alone with his brother-in-law, poured himself out a glass of water, and opened a sandwich box. "I cannot persuade you to adopt my regimen, Vincey." "No, no, I've no opinion of that system. Life wants padding," said Mr. Vincey, unable to omit his portable theory. "However," he went on, accenting the word, as if to dismiss all irrelevance, "what I came here to talk about was a little affair of my young scapegrace Fred's." "That is a subject on which you and I are likely to take quite as different views as on diet, Vincey." "I hope not this time." Mr. Vincey was resolved to be good humoured. "The fact is, it's about a whim of old Featherstone's. Somebody has been cooking up a story out of spite, and telling it to the old man to try to set him against Fred. He's very fond of Fred, and is likely to do something handsome for him. Indeed, he has as good as told Fred that he means to leave him his land, and that makes other people jealous." "Vincey, I must repeat that you will not get any concurrence from me as to the course you have pursued with your eldest son. It was entirely from worldly vanity that you destined him for the church. With a family of 3 sons and 4 daughters, you were not warranted in devoting money to an expensive education which has succeeded in nothing but in giving him extravagant idle habits. You are now reaping the consequences." To point out other people's errors was a duty that Mr. Bulstrode rarely shrank from, but Mr. Vincey was not equally prepared to be patient. When a man has the immediate prospect of being mayor, and is ready, in the interests of commerce, to take up a firm attitude on politics generally, he has naturally a sense of his importance to the framework of things, which seems to throw questions of private conduct into the background. And this particular reproof irritated him more than any other. It was eminently superfluous to him to be told that he was reaping the consequences. But he felt his neck under Bulstrode's yoke, and though he usually enjoyed kicking, he was anxious to refrain from that relief. "As to that, Bulstrode, it's no use going back. I'm not one of your pattern men, and I don't pretend to be. I couldn't foresee everything in the trade. There wasn't a finer business in Middlemarch than ours, and the lad was clever." My poor brother was in the church, and would have done well, had got preferment already, but that stomach fever took him off, else he might have been a dean by this time. I think I was justified in what I tried to do for Fred. If you come to religion, it seems to me a man shouldn't want to carve out his meat to an ounce beforehand. One must trust a little to Providence, and be generous. It's a good British feeling to try and raise your family a little. In my opinion, it's a father's duty to give his sons a fine chance. I don't wish to act otherwise than as your best friend, Vincey, when I say that what you have been uttering just now is one mass of worldliness and inconsistent folly." "Very well," said Mr. Vincey, kicking in spite of resolutions. "I never professed to be anything but worldly, and what's more, I don't see anybody else who's not worldly. I suppose you don't conduct business on what you call unworldly principles. The only difference I see is that one worldliness is a little bit honester than another." "This kind of discussion is unfruitful, Vincey," said Mr. Bulstrode, who, finishing his sandwich, had thrown himself back in his chair and shaded his eyes as if weary. "You had some more particular business." "Yes, yes. The long and short of it is, somebody has told old Featherstone, giving you as the authority, that Fred has been borrowing or trying to borrow money on prospect of his land." "Of course you never said any such nonsense, but the old fellow will insist on it that Fred should bring him a denial in your handwriting. That is just a bit of note saying you don't believe a word of such stuff, either of his having borrowed or tried to borrow in such a fool's way. I suppose you can have no objection to that?" "Pardon me, I have an objection. I am by no means sure that your son, in his recklessness and ignorance I will use no severer word has not tried to raise money by holding out his future prospects, or even that someone may not have been foolish enough to supply him on so vague a presumption. There is plenty of such lax money lending as of other folly in the world." "But Fred gives me his honour that he has never borrowed money on the pretence of any understanding about his uncle's land. He is not a liar. I don't want to make him better than he is. I have blown him up well. Nobody can say I wink at what he does. But he is not a liar. And I should have thought, but I may be wrong, that there was no religion to hinder a man from believing the best of a young fellow, when you don't know worse. It seems to me it would be a poor sort of religion to put a spoke in his wheel by refusing to say you don't believe such harm of him as you've got no good reason to believe." "I am not at all sure that I should be befriending your son by smoothing his way to the future possession of Featherstone's property. I cannot regard wealth as a blessing to those who use it simply as a harvest for this world. You do not like to hear these things, Vincey, but on this occasion I feel called upon to tell you that I have no motive for furthering such a disposition of property as that which you refer to. I do not shrink from saying that it will not tend to your son's eternal welfare or to the glory of God. Why then should you expect me to pen this kind of affidavit, which has no object but to keep up a foolish partiality and secure a foolish bequest? If you mean to hinder everybody from having money but saints and evangelists, you must give up some profitable partnerships, that's all I can say." Mr. Vincey burst out very bluntly. "It may be for the glory of God, but it is not for the glory of the Middlemarch trade, that Plymdale's house uses those blue and green dyes it gets from the brassing manufactory. They rot the silk, that's all I know about it. Perhaps if other people knew so much of the profit went to the glory of God, they might like it better, but I don't mind so much about that. I could get up a pretty row if I chose." Mr. Bulstrode paused a little before he answered. "You pain me very much by speaking in this way, Vincey. I do not expect you to understand my grounds of action. It is not an easy thing even to thread a path for principles in the intricacies of the world, still less to make the thread clear for the careless and the scoffing. You must remember, if you please, that I stretch my tolerance towards you as my wife's brother, and that it little becomes you to complain of me as withholding material help towards a worldly position for your family. I must remind you that it is not your own prudence or judgment that has enabled you to keep your place in the trade." "Very likely not. But you have been no loser by my trade yet," said Mr. Vincey, thoroughly nettled, a result which was seldom much retarded by previous resolutions. And when you married Harriet, I don't see how you could expect that our families should not hang by the same nail. If you've changed your mind and want my family to come down in the world, you'd better say so. I've never changed. I'm a plain churchman now, just as I used to be before doctrines came up. I take the world as I find it, in trade and everything else. I'm content to be no worse than my neighbours. But if you want us to come down in the world, say so. I shall know better what to do then. Of this letter about your son? Well, whether or not I consider it very unhandsome of you to refuse it, such doings may be lined with religion, but outside they have a nasty dog in the manger look. You might as well slander Fred. It comes pretty near to it when you refuse to say you didn't set a slander going. It's this sort of thing, this tyrannical spirit, wanting to play bishop and banker everywhere. It's this sort of thing makes a man's name stink. Vincey, if you insist on quarrelling with me, it will be exceedingly painful to Harriet as well as myself, said Mr. Bulstrode, with a trifle more eagerness and paleness than usual. I don't want to quarrel. It's for my interest, and perhaps for yours too, that we should be friends. I bear you no grudge. I think no worse of you than I do of other people. A man who half starves himself and goes the length in family prayers and so on, that you do, believes in his religion whatever it may be, you could turn over your capital just as fast with cursing and swearing. Plenty of fellows do. You like to be master, there's no denying that. You must be first chop in heaven, else you won't like it much. But you're my sister's husband, and we ought to stick together. And if I know Harriet, she'll consider it your fault if we quarrel, because you strain at a gnat in this way, and refuse to do Fred a good turn. And I don't mean to say I shall bear it well. I consider it unhandsome. Mr. Vincey rose, began to button his great coat, and looked steadily at his brother-in-law, meaning to imply a demand for a decisive answer. This was not the first time that Mr. Bulstrode had begun by admonishing Mr. Vincey, and had ended by seeing a very unsatisfactory reflection of himself in the coarse, unflattering mirror which that manufacturer's mind presented to the subtler lights and shadows of his fellow men. And perhaps his experience ought to have warned him how the scene would end. But a full-fed fountain will be generous with its waters even in the rain, when they are worse than youthless, and a fine fount of admonition is apt to be equally irrepressible. It was not in Mr. Bulstrode's nature to comply directly in consequence of uncomfortable suggestions. Before changing his course, he always needed to shape his motives and bring them into accordance with his habitual standard. He said at last: "I will reflect a little, Vincey. I will mention the subject to Harriet. I shall probably send you a letter." "Very well. As soon as you can, please. I hope it will all be settled before I see you tomorrow." End of chapter 13. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 14. Follows here the strict receipt for that sauce to dainty meat, named idleness, which many eat by preference and call it sweet. First watch for morsels, like a hound. Mix well with buffets, stir them round with good thick oil of flatteries, and froth with self-lauding lies. Serve warm, the vessels you must choose. To keep it in are dead men's shoes. Mr. Bulstrode's consultation of Harriet seemed to have had the effect desired by Mr. Vincey, for early the next morning a letter came which Fred could carry to Mr. Featherstone as the required testimony. The old gentleman was staying in bed on account of the cold weather, and as Mary Garth was not to be seen in the sitting room, Fred went upstairs immediately and presented the letter to his uncle, who, propped up comfortably on the bed rest, was not less able than usual to enjoy his consciousness of wisdom in distrusting and frustrating mankind. He put on his spectacles to read the letter, pursuing up his lips and drawing down their corners. "Under the circumstances I will not decline to state my conviction." Pshaw! What fine words the fellow puts. He's as fine as an auctioneer. that your son Frederick has not obtained any advance of money on bequests promised by Mr. Featherstone. Promised? Who said I had ever promised? I promise nothing. I shall make codicils as long as I like, and that considering the nature of such proceeding, it is unreasonable to presume that a young man of sense and character would attempt it. Ah, but the gentleman doesn't say you are a young man of sense and character. Mark you that, sir. As to my own concern with any report of such nature, I distinctly affirm that I never made any statement to the effect that your son had borrowed money on any property that might accrue to him on Mr. Featherstone's demise. Bless my heart! Property accrue, demise! Lawyer Standish is nothing to him. He couldn't speak finer if he wanted to borrow. Well, Mr. Featherstone here looked over his spectacles at Fred, while he handed back the letter to him, with a contemptuous gesture. You don't suppose I believe a thing because Bulstrode writes it out fine, eh? Fred collared. You wish to have the letter, sir? I should think it very likely that Mr. Bulstrode's denials is as good as the authority which told you what he denies. Every bit. I never said I believed either one or the other. Now, what do you expect? Said Mr. Featherstone curtly, keeping on his spectacles, but withdrawing his hands under his wraps. I expect nothing, sir. Fred with difficulty restrained himself from venting his irritation. I came to bring you the letter. If you like, I will bid you good morning. Not yet, not yet. Ring the bell. I want Missy to come. It was a servant who came in answer to the bell. Tell Missy to come, said Mr. Featherstone impatiently. What business had she to go away? He spoke in the same tone when Mary came. Why couldn't you sit still here till I told you to go? Want my waistcoat now? I told you always to put it on the bed. Mary's eyes looked rather red, as if she had been crying. It was clear that Mr. Featherstone was in one of his most snappish humours this morning, and though Fred had now the prospect of receiving the much needed present of money, he would have preferred being free to turn round on the old tyrant and tell him that Mary Garth was too good to be at his beck. Though Fred had risen as she entered the room, she had barely noticed him, and looked as if her nerves were quivering with the expectation that something would be thrown at her. But she never had anything worse than words to dread. When she went to reach the waistcoat from a peg, Fred went up to her side and said, Allow me. Let it alone. You bring it, Missy, and lay it down here, said Mr. Featherstone. Now you go away again till I call you, he added, when the waistcoat was laid down by him. It was usual with him to season his pleasure in showing favour to one person by being especially disagreeable to another, and Mary was always at hand to furnish the condiment. When his own relatives came, she was treated better. Slowly he took out a bunch of keys from the waistcoat pocket, and slowly he drew forth a tin box which was under the bedclothes. You expect I am going to give you a little fortune, eh? He said, looking above his spectacles and pausing in the act of opening the lid. Not at all, sir. You were good enough to speak of making me a present the other day, else, of course, I should not have thought of the matter. But Fred was of a hopeful disposition, and a vision had presented itself of a sum just large enough to deliver him from a certain anxiety. When Fred got into debt, it always seemed to him highly probable that something or other, he did not necessarily conceive what, would come to pass enabling him to pay in due time. And now that the providential occurrence was apparently close at hand, it would have been sheer absurdity to think that the supply would be short of the need. As absurd as a faith that believed in half a miracle for want of strength to believe in a whole one. The deep veined hands fingered many bank notes, one after the other, laying them down flat again, while Fred leaned back in his chair, scorning to look eager. He held himself to be a gentleman at heart, and did not like courting an old fellow for his money. At last Mr. Featherstone eyed him again over his spectacles and presented him with a little sheaf of notes. Fred could see distinctly that there were but 5, as the less significant edges gaped towards him, but then each might mean £50. He took them, saying, I am very much obliged to you, sir, and was going to roll them up without seeming to think of their value. But this did not suit Mr. Featherstone, who was eyeing him intently. Come, don't you think it worth your while to count them? You take money like a lord. I suppose you lose it like one. I thought I was not to look a gift horse in the mouth, sir, but I shall be very happy to count them. Fred was not so happy, however, after he had counted them, for they actually presented the absurdity of being less than his hopefulness had decided that they must be. What can the fitness of things mean, if not their fitness to a man's expectations? Failing this, absurdity and atheism gaped behind him. The collapse for Fred was severe when he found that he held no more than 5/20, and his share in the higher education of his country did not seem to help him. Nevertheless, he said, with rapid changes in his fair complexion, "It is very handsome of you, sir." "I should think it is," said Mr. Featherstone, locking his box and replacing it, then taking off his spectacles deliberately, and at length, as if his inward meditation had more deeply convinced him, repeating, "I should think it handsome." "I assure you, sir, I am very grateful," said Fred, who had had time to recover his cheerful air. "So you ought to be. You want to cut a figure in the world, and I reckon Peter Featherstone is the only one you've got to trust to." Here the old man's eyes gleamed with a curiously mingled satisfaction in the consciousness that this smart young fellow relied upon him, and that the smart young fellow was rather a fool for doing so. "Yes, indeed. I was not born to very splendid chances. Few men have been more cramped than I have been," said Fred, with some sense of surprise at his own virtue, considering how hardly he was dealt with. "It really seems a little too bad to have to ride a broken-winded hunter, and see men, who are not half such good judges as yourself, able to throw away any amount of money on buying bad bargains." "Well, you can buy yourself a fine hunter now. £80 is enough for that, I reckon, and you'll have £20 over to get yourself out of any little scrape," said Mr. Featherstone, chuckling slightly. "You are very good, sir," said Fred, with a fine sense of contrast between the words and his feeling. "Aye, rather a better uncle than your fine Uncle Bulstrode. You won't get much out of his speculations, I think. He's got a pretty strong string round your father's leg by what I hear, eh?" "My father never tells me anything about his affairs, sir." "Well, he shows some sense there. But other people find 'em out without his telling. He'll never have much to leave you. He'll most like die without will. He's the sort of man to do it. Let 'em make him Mayor of Middlemarch as much as they like, but you won't get much by his dying without a will, though you are the eldest son." Fred thought that Mr. Featherstone had never been so disagreeable before. True, he had never before given him quite so much money at once. "Shall I destroy this letter of Mr. Bulstrode's, sir?" said Fred, rising with the letter as if he would put it in the fire. "Aye, aye, I don't want it. It's worth no money to me." Fred carried the letter to the fire and thrust the poker through it with much zest. He longed to get out of the room, but he was a little ashamed before his inner self, as well as before his uncle, to run away immediately after pocketing the money. Presently the farm bailiff came up to give his master a report, and Fred, to his unspeakable relief, was dismissed with the injunction to come again soon. He had longed not only to be set free from his uncle, but also to find Mary Garth. She was now in her usual place by the fire, with sewing in her hands and a book open on the little table by her side. Her eyelids had lost some of their redness now, and she had her usual air of self-command. "Am I wanted upstairs?" she said, half rising as Fred entered. "No, I am only dismissed because Simmons is gone up." Mary sat down again and resumed her work. She was certainly treating him with more indifference than usual. She did not know how affectionately indignant he had felt on her behalf upstairs. "May I stay here a little, Mary, or shall I bore you?" "Pray sit down," said Mary. "You will not be so heavy a bore as Mr. John Wall, who was here yesterday, and he sat down without asking my leave. Poor fellow, I think he is in love with you." "I am not aware of it, and to me it is one of the most odious things in a girl's life, that there must always be some supposition of falling in love coming between her and any man who is kind to her, and to whom she is grateful. I should have thought that I, at least, might have been saved from all that." I have no ground for the nonsensical vanity of fancying everybody who comes near me is in love with me." Mary did not mean to betray any feeling, but in spite of herself she ended in a tremulous tone of vexation. "Confound John Wall! I did not mean to make you angry. I didn't know you had any reason for being grateful to me. I forgot what a great service you think it if any one snuffs a candle for you." Fred also had his pride, and was not going to show that he knew what had called forth this outburst of Mary's. "Oh, I'm not angry, except with the ways of the world. I do like to be spoken to as if I had common sense. I really often feel that if I could understand a little more than I ever hear even from young gentlemen who have been to college." Mary had recovered, and she spoke with a suppressed rippling undercurrent of laughter pleasant to hear. "I don't care how merry you are at my expense this morning," said Fred. "I thought you looked so sad when you came upstairs. It's a shame you should stay here to be bullied in that way." "Oh, I have an easy life by comparison. I have tried being a teacher, and I'm not fit for that. My mind is too fond of wandering on its own way. I think any hardship is better than pretending to do what one is paid for and never really doing it. Everything here I can do as well as any one else could, perhaps better than some, Rosie, for example, though she's just the sort of beautiful creature that is imprisoned with ogres in fairy tales." "Rosie?" cried Fred in a tone of profound brotherly skepticism. "Come, Fred," said Mary emphatically, "you have no right to be so critical. Do you mean anything particular just now?" "No, I mean something general, always." "Oh, that I'm idle and extravagant. Well, I'm not fit to be a poor man. I should not have made a bad fellow if I had been rich." "You would have done your duty in that state of life to which it has not pleased God to call you," said Mary, laughing. "Well, I couldn't do my duty as a clergyman any more than you could do yours as a governess. You ought to have a little fellow feeling there, Mary." "I never said you ought to be a clergyman. There are other sorts of work. It seems to me very miserable not to resolve on some course and act accordingly." "So I could if—" Fred broke off and stood up, leaning against the mantelpiece. "If you were sure you should not have a fortune?" "I did not say that. You want to quarrel with me. It's too bad of you to be guided by what other people say about me." "How can I want to quarrel with you? I should be quarrelling with all my new books," said Mary, lifting the volume on the table. "However naughty you may be to other people, you are good to me." "Because I like you better than anyone else. But I know you despise me." "Yes, I do a little," said Mary, nodding with a smile. "You would admire a stupendous fellow who would have wise opinions about everything." "Yes, I should." Mary was sewing swiftly, and seemed provokingly mistress of the situation. When a conversation had taken a wrong turn for us, we only get farther and farther into the swamp of awkwardness. This was what Fred Vincey felt. "I suppose a woman is never in love with anyone she has always known, ever since she can remember, as a man often is. It is always some new fellow who strikes a girl." "Let me see," said Mary, the corners of her mouth curling archly. "I must go back on my experience. There is Juliet. She seems an example of what you say. But then Ophelia had probably known Hamlet a long while, and Brenda Troy, she had known Mordaunt Merton ever since they were children, but then he seems to have been an estimable young man. And Minna was still more deeply in love with Cleveland, who was a stranger. Waverley was new to Flora McIlvore, but then she did not fall in love with him. And there are Olivia and Sophia Primrose and Corinne. They may be said to have fallen in love with new men. Altogether, my experience is rather mixed." Mary looked up with some roguishness at Fred, and that look of hers was dear to him, though the eyes were nothing more than clear windows where observation sat laughingly. He was certainly an affectionate fellow, and as he had grown from boy to man, he had grown in love with his old playmate, notwithstanding that share in the higher education of the country which had exalted his views of rank and income. When a man is not loved, it is no use for him to say that he could be a better fellow, could do anything, I mean, if he were sure of being loved in return. Not of the least use in the world for him to say he could be better. Might, could, would, they are contemptible auxiliaries. I don't see how a man is to be good for much unless he has some one woman to love him dearly. I think the goodness should come before he expects that. You know better, Mary. Women don't love men for their goodness. Perhaps not, but if they love them, they never think them bad. It is hardly fair to say I am bad. I said nothing at all about you. I never shall be good for anything, Mary, if you will not say that you love me. If you will not promise to marry me, I mean, when I am able to marry. If I did love you, I would not marry you. I would certainly not promise ever to marry you. I think that is quite wicked, Mary. If you love me, you ought to promise to marry me. On the contrary, I think it would be wicked in me to marry you even if I did love you. You mean just as I am, without any means of maintaining a wife? Of course, I am but 23. In that last point you will alter. But I am not sure of any other alteration. My father says an idle man ought not to exist, much less be married. Then I am to blow my brains out? No, on the whole I should think you would do better to pass your examination. I've heard Mr. Fairbrother say it's disgracefully easy. That is all very fine. Anything is easy to him. Not that cleverness has anything to do with it. I am 10 times cleverer than many men who pass. Dear me, said Mary, unable to repress her sarcasm. That accounts for the curates like Mr. Krause. Divide your cleverness by 10, and the quotient, dear me, is able to take a gree. But that only shows you are 10 times more idle than the others. Well, if I did pass, you would not want me to go into the church? That is not the question. What I want you to do. You have a conscience of your own, I suppose. There is Mr. Lydgate. I must go and tell my uncle. Mary, said Fred, seizing her hand as she rose, if you will not give me some encouragement, I shall get worse instead of better. I will not give you any encouragement, said Mary, reddening. Your friends would dislike it, and so would mine. My father would think it a disgrace to me if I accepted a man who got into debt and would not work. Fred was stung, and released her hand. She walked to the door, but there she turned and said, Fred, you have always been so good, so generous to me. I am not ungrateful, but never speak to me in that way again. Very well, said Fred sulkily, taking up his hat and whip. His complexion showed patches of pale pink and dead white. Like many a plucked idle young gentleman, he was thoroughly in love, and with a plain girl who had no money. But having Mr. Featherstone's land in the background, and a persuasion that, let Mary say what she would, she really did care for him, Fred was not utterly in despair. When he got home he gave 4 of the 20s to his mother, asking her to keep them for him. I don't want to spend that money, mother. I want it to pay a debt with. So keep it safe from my fingers. Bless you, my dear, said Mrs. Vincey. She doted on her eldest son and her youngest girl, a child of 6, whom others thought her 2 naughtiest children. The mother's eyes are not always deceived in their partiality. She at least can best judge who is the tender, filial-hearted child, and Fred was certainly very fond of his mother. Perhaps it was his fondness for another person also that made him particularly anxious to take some security against his own liability to spend the £100, for the creditor to whom he owed 160 held a firmer security in the shape of a bill signed by Mary's father. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. Black eyes you've left, you say. Blue eyes failed to draw you. Yet you seem more rapt today than of old we saw you. Oh, I track the fairest fair through new haunts of pleasure. Footprints here and echoes there guide me to my treasure. Lo, she turns immortal youth, wrought to mortal stature, fresh as starlight's aged truth, many named Nature. A great historian, as he insisted on calling himself, who had the happiness to be dead 120 years ago, and so to take his place among the Colossi whose huge legs our living pettiness is observed to walk under, glorious in his copious remarks and digressions as the least imitable part of his work, and especially in those initial chapters to the successive books of his history, where he seems to bring his armchair to the proscenium and chat with us in all the lusty ease of his fine English. But Fielding lived when the days were longer, for time, like money, is measured by our needs. When summer afternoons were spacious and the clock ticked slowly in the winter evenings, we belated historians must not linger after his example, and if we did so, it is probable that our chat would be thin and eager, as if delivered from a camp stool in a parrot house. I at least have so much to do in unravelling certain human lots, and seeing how they were woven and interwoven, that all the light I can command must be concentrated on this particular web, and not dispersed over that tempting range of relevancies called the universe. At present I have to make the new settler Lydgate better known to any one interested in him than he could possibly be even to those who had seen the most of him since his arrival in Middlemarch. For surely all must admit that a man may be puffed and belauded, envied, ridiculed, counted upon as a tool, and fallen in love with, or at least selected as a future husband, and yet remain virtually unknown, known merely as a cluster of signs for his neighbours' false suppositions. There was a general impression, however, that Lydgate was not altogether a common country doctor, and in Middlemarch at that time such an impression was significant of great things being expected from him, for everybody's family doctor was remarkably clever, and was understood to have immeasurable skill in the management and training of the most skittish of vicious diseases. The evidence of his cleverness was of the higher intuitive order, lying in his lady patients' immovable conviction, and was unassailable by any objection except that their intuitions were opposed by others equally strong. Each lady who saw medical truth in wrench and the strengthening treatment, regarding Toller and the lowering system as medical perdition, for the heroic times of copious bleeding and blistering had not yet departed, still less the times of thoroughgoing theory, when disease in general was called by some bad name and treated accordingly, without shilly-shally, as if, for example, it were to be called insurrection, which must not be fired on with blank cartridge, but have its blood drawn at once. The strengtheners and the lowering were all clever men in somebody's opinion, which is really as much as can be said for any living talents. Nobody's imagination had gone so far as to conjecture that Mr. Lydgate could know as much as Dr. Sprague or Dr. Minchin, the two physicians who alone could offer any hope when danger was extreme, and when the smallest hope was worth a guinea. Still, I repeat, there was a general impression that Lydgate was something rather more uncommon than any general practitioner in Middlemarch. And this was true. He was but 27, an age at which many men are not quite common, at which they are hopeful of achievement, resolute in avoidance, thinking that Mammon shall never put a bit in their mouths and get astride their backs, but rather that Mammon, if they have anything to do with him, shall draw their chariot. He had been left an orphan when he was fresh from public school. His father, a military man, had made but little provision for 3 children, and when the boy Tertius asked to have a medical education, it seemed easier to his guardians to grant his request by apprenticing him to a country practitioner than to make any objections on the score of family dignity. He was one of the rarer lads who early get a decided bent and make up their minds that there is something particular in life which they would like to do for its own sake and not because their fathers did it. Most of us who turn to any subject with love remember some morning or evening hour when we got on a high stool to reach down an untried volume, or sat with parted lips listening to a new talker, or for very lack of books began to listen to the voices within, as the first traceable beginning of our love. Something of that sort happened to Lydgate. He was a quick fellow, and when hot from play would toss himself in a corner, and in 5 minutes be deep in any sort of book that he could lay his hands on. If it were Rasselas or Gulliver, so much the better, but Bailey's Dictionary would do, or the Bible with the Apocrypha in it. Something he must read when he was not riding the pony, or running and hunting, or listening to the talk of men. And this was true of him. At 10 years of age he had then read through Chrysal, or The Adventures of a Guinea, which was neither milk for babes nor any chalky mixture meant to pass for milk, and it had already occurred to him that books were stuff, and that life was stupid. His school studies had not much modified that opinion, for though he did his classics and mathematics, he was not pre-eminent in them. It was said of him that Lydgate could do anything he liked, but he had certainly not yet liked to do anything remarkable. He was a vigorous animal, with a ready understanding, but no spark had yet kindled in him an intellectual passion. Knowledge seemed to him a very superficial affair, easily mastered, judging from the conversation of his elders. He had apparently got already more than was necessary for mature life. Probably this was not an exceptional result of expensive teaching at that period of short waisted coats and other fashions which have not yet recurred. But one vacation, a wet day sent him to the small home library to hunt once more for a book which might have some freshness for him. In vain, unless indeed he took down a dusty row of volumes with grey paper backs and dingy labels, the volumes of an old cyclopaedia which he had never disturbed. It would at least be a novelty to disturb them. They were on the highest shelf, and he stood on a chair to get them down. But he opened the volume which he first took from the shelf. Somehow one is apt to read in a makeshift attitude, just where it might seem inconvenient to do so. The page he opened on was under the head of Anatomy, and the first passage that drew his eyes was on the valves of the heart. He was not much acquainted with valves of any sort, but he knew that the valva were folding doors, and through this crevice came a sudden light startling him with his first vivid notion of finely adjusted mechanism in the human frame. A liberal education had of course left him free to read the indecent passages in the school classics, but beyond a general sense of secrecy and obscenity in connection with his internal structure, had left his imagination quite unbiased, so that for anything he knew his brains lay in small bags at his temples, and he had no more thought of representing to himself how his blood circulated than how paper served instead of gold. But the moment of occasion had come, and before he got down from his chair, the world was made new to him by presentiment of endless processes filling the vast spaces blanked out of his sight by that wordy ignorance which he had supposed to be knowledge. From that hour Lydgate felt the growth of an intellectual passion. We are not afraid of telling over and over again how a man comes to fall in love with a woman and be wedded to her, or else be fatally parted from her. It is due to excess of poetry or of stupidity that we are never weary of describing what King James called a woman's Macdom and her fairness, never weary of listening for the twanging of the old troubadour strings, and are comparatively uninterested in that other kind of Macdom and fairness which must be wooed with industrious thought and patient renunciation of small desires. In the story of this passion, too, the development varies. Sometimes it is the glorious marriage, sometimes frustration and final parting, and not seldom the catastrophe is bound up with the other passion sung by the troubadours. For in the multitude of middle aged men who go about their vocations in a daily course determined for them much in the same way as the tie of their cravats, there is always a good number who once meant to shape their own deeds and alter the world a little. The story of their coming to be shapen, after the average and fit to be packed by the gross, is hardly ever told even in their consciousness, for perhaps their ardour in generous unpaid toil cooled as imperceptibly as the ardour of other youthful loves, till one day their earlier self walked like a ghost in its old home and made the new furniture ghastly. Nothing in the world more subtle than the process of their gradual change. In the beginning they inhaled it unknowingly, You and I may have sent some of our breaths towards infecting them, when we uttered our conforming falsities or drew our silly conclusions, or perhaps it came with the vibrations from a woman's glance. Lydgate did not mean to be one of those failures, and there was the better hope of him because his scientific interest soon took the form of a professional enthusiasm. He had a youthful belief in his bread-winning work, not to be stifled by that initiation in makeshift called his prentice days, and he carried to his studies in London, Edinburgh, and Paris the conviction that the medical profession, as it might be, was the finest in the world, presenting the most perfect interchange between science and art, offering the most direct alliance between intellectual conquest and the social good. Lydgate's nature demanded this combination. He was an emotional creature, with a flesh and blood sense of fellowship which withstood all the abstractions of special study. He cared not only for cases, but for John and Elizabeth, especially Elizabeth. There was another attraction in his profession. It wanted reform, and gave a man an opportunity for some indignant resolve to reject its venal decorations and other humbug, and to be the possessor of genuine though undemanded qualifications. He went to study in Paris with the determination that when he, provincial home again, he would settle in some provincial town as a general practitioner and resist the irrational severance between medical and surgical knowledge in the interest of his own scientific pursuits, as well as of all the general advance. He would keep away from the range of London intrigues, jealousies, and social truckling, and win celebrity, however slowly, as Jenner had done, by the independent value of his work. For it must be remembered that this was a dark period, and in spite of venerable colleges, which used great efforts to secure purity of knowledge by making it scarce, and to exclude error by a rigid exclusiveness in relation to fees and appointments, it happened that very ignorant young gentlemen were promoted in town, and many more got a legal right to practice over large areas in the country. Also, the high standard held up to the public mind by the college of which gave its peculiar sanction to the expensive and highly rarefied medical instruction obtained by graduates of Oxford and Cambridge, did not hinder quackery from having an excellent time of it. For, since professional practice chiefly consisted in giving a great many drugs, the public inferred that it might be better off with more drugs still, if they could only be got cheaply, and hence swallowed large cubic measures of physic prescribed by unscrupulous ignorance which had taken no degrees. Considering the statistics had not yet embraced a calculation as to the number of ignorant or canting doctors, which absolutely must exist in the teeth of all changes, it seemed to Lydgate that a change in the units was the most direct mode of changing the numbers. He meant to be unit who would make a certain amount of difference towards that spreading change, which would one day tell appreciably upon the averages, and in the meantime have the pleasure of making an advantageous difference to the viscera of his own patients. But he did not simply aim at a more genuine kind of practice than was common. He was ambitious of a wider effect. He was fired with the possibility that he might work out the proof of an anatomical conception and make a link in the chain of discovery. Does it seem incongruous to you that a Middlemarch surgeon should dream of himself as a discoverer? Most of us indeed know little of the great originators until they have been lifted up among the constellations and already rule our fates. That Herschel, for example, who broke the barriers of the heavens, did he not once play a provincial church organ, and give musical lessons to stumbling pianists? Each of those shining ones had to walk on the earth among neighbours who perhaps thought much more of his gait and his garments than of anything which was to give him a title of everlasting fame. Each of them had his little local personal history sprinkled with small temptations and sordid cares, which made the retarding friction of his course towards final companionship with the immortals. Lydgate was not blind to the dangers of such friction, but he had plenty of confidence in his resolution to avoid it as far as possible. Being 27, he felt himself experienced, and he was not going to have his vanities provoked by contact with the showy worldly successes of the capital, but to live among people who could hold no rivalry with that pursuit of a great idea, which was to be a twin object with the assiduous practice of his profession. There was fascination in the hope that the two purposes would illuminate each other, the careful observation and inference, which was his daily work, the use of the lens to further his judgment in special cases, would further his thought as an instrument of larger inquiry. Was not this the typical preeminence of his profession? He would be a good Middlemarch doctor, and by that very means keep himself in the track of far-reaching investigation. On one point he may fairly claim approval at this particular stage of his career. He did not mean to imitate those philanthropic models who made a profit out of poisonous pickles to support themselves, while they are exposing adulteration, or hold shares in a gambling hell that they may have leisure to represent the cause of public morality. He intended to begin in his own case some particular reforms which were quite certainly within his reach, and much less of a problem than the demonstrating of an anatomical conception. One of these reforms was to act stoutly on the strength of a recent legal decision and simply prescribe without dispensing drugs or taking percentage from druggists. This was an innovation for one who had chosen to adopt the style of general practitioner in a country town, and would be felt as offensive criticism by his professional brethren. But Lydgate meant to innovate in this treatment also, and he was wise enough to see that the best security for his practising honestly according to his belief was to get rid of systematic temptations to the contrary. Perhaps that was a more cheerful time for observers and theorizers than the present. We are apt to think it the finest era of the world when America was beginning to be discovered, when a bold sailor, even if he were wrecked, might alight on a new kingdom, and about 1829 the dark territories of pathology were a fine America for a spirited young adventurer. Lydgate was ambitious above all to contribute towards enlarging the scientific rational basis of his profession. The more he became interested in special questions of disease, such as the nature of fever or fevers, the more keenly he felt the need for that fundamental knowledge of structure which just at the beginning of the century had been illuminated by the brief and glorious career of Beechat, who died when he was only 31, but like another Alexander left a realm large enough for many heirs. That great Frenchman first carried out the conception that living bodies, fundamentally considered, are no associations of organs, which can be understood by studying them first apart and then, as it were, federally, but must be regarded as consisting of certain primary webs or tissues, out of which the various organs, brain, heart, lungs, and so on, are compacted, as the various accommodations of a house are built up in various proportions of wood, iron, stone, brick, zinc, and the rest, each material having its peculiar composition and proportions. No man, one sees, can understand and estimate the entire structure or its parts, what are its frailties and what its repairs, without knowing the nature of the materials. And the conception brought out by Beechat, with his detailed study of the different tissues, acted necessarily on medical questions as the turning of gaslight would act on a dim oil-lit street, showing new connections and hitherto hidden facts of structure which must be taken into account in considering the symptoms of maladies and the action of medicaments. But results which depended on human conscience and intelligence work slowly, and now at the end of 1829 most medical practice was still strutting or shambling along the old paths, and there was still scientific work to be done which might have seemed to be a direct sequence of Beechat's. This great seer did not go beyond the consideration of the tissues as ultimate facts in the living organism, marking the limit of anatomical analysis, but it was open to another mind to say, have not these structures some common basis from which they have all started, as your sarcenet, gauze, net, satin, and velvet from the raw cocoon? Here would be another light, as of oxyhydrogen, showing the very grain of things, and revising all former explanations. Of this sequence to Bichat's work, already vibrating along many currents of the European mind, Lydgate was enamoured. He longed to demonstrate the more intimate relations of living structure, and help to define men's thought more accurately after the true order. The work had not yet been done, but only prepared for those who knew how to use the preparation. What was the primitive tissue? In that way Lydgate put the question, not quite in the way required by the awaiting answer, but such missing of the right word befalls many seekers, and he counted on quiet intervals to be watchfully seized for taking up threads of investigation, on many hints to be won from diligent application, not only of the scalpel, but of the microscope, which research had begun to use again with new enthusiasm of reliance. Such was Lydgate's plan of his future, to do good small work for Middlemarch and great work for the world. He was certainly a happy fellow at this time, to be 27, without any fixed vices, with a generous resolution that his actions should be beneficent, and with ideas in his brain that made life interesting, quite apart from the cultus of horse flesh, and other mystic rites of costly observance, which the £800 left him after buying his practice would certainly not have gone far in paying for. He was at a starting point which makes many a man's career a fine subject for betting, if there were any gentleman given to that amusement who could appreciate the complicated probabilities of an arduous purpose with all the possible thwartings and furtherings of circumstance, all the niceties of inward balance by which a man swims and makes his point, or else is carried headlong. The risk would remain, even with close knowledge of Lydgate's character, for character too is a process and an unfolding. The man was still in the making, as much as the Middlemarch doctor and immortal discoverer, and there were both virtues and faults capable of shrinking or expanding. The faults will not, I hope, be a reason for the withdrawal of your interest in him. Among our valued friends is there not some one or other who is a little too self-confident and disdainful, whose distinguished mind is a little spotted with commonness, who is a little pinched here and protuberant there with native prejudices, or whose better energies are liable to lapse down the wrong channel under the influence of transient solicitations? All these things might be alleged against Lydgate, but then they are the periphrases of a polite preacher, who talks of Adam, and would not like to mention anything painful to the pew renters. The particular faults from which these delicate generalities are distilled have distinguishable physiognomies, diction, accent, and grimaces, filling up parts in very various dramas. Our vanities differ, as our noses do. All conceit is not the same conceit, but varies in correspondence with the minutiae of mental make in which one of us differs from another. Lydgate's conceit was of the arrogant sort, never simpering, never impertinent, but massive in its claims and benevolently contemptuous. He would do a great deal for noodles, being sorry for them, and feeling quite sure that they could have no power over him. He had thought of joining the Saint Simonians when he was in Paris, in order to turn them against some of their own doctrines. All his faults were marked by kindred traits, and were those of a man who had a fine baritone, whose clothes hung well upon him, and who even in his ordinary gestures had an air of inbred distinction. Where then lay the spots of commonness? says a young lady enamoured of that careless grace. How could there be any commonness in a man so well bred, so ambitious of social distinction, so generous and unusual in his views of social duty? As easily as there may be stupidity in a man of genius if you take him unawares on the wrong subject, or as many a man who has the best will to advance the social millennium might be ill inspired in imagining its lighter pleasures, unable to go beyond Offenbach's music, or the brilliant punning in the last burlesque. Lydgate's spots of commonness lay in the complexion of his prejudices, which, in spite of noble intention and sympathy, were half of them such as are found in ordinary men of the world. That distinction of mind, which belonged to his intellectual ardour, did not penetrate his feelings and judgment about furniture or women or the desirability of its being known, without his telling, that he was better born than other country surgeons. He did not mean to think of furniture at present, but whenever he did so it was to be feared that neither biology or schemes of reform would lift him above the vulgarity of feeling that there would be an incompatibility in his furniture not being of the best. As to women, he had once already been drawn headlong by impetuous folly, which he meant to be final, since marriage at some distant period would of course not be impetuous. For those who want to be acquainted with Lydgate, it will be good to know what was that case of impetuous folly, for it may stand as an example of the fitful swerving of passion to which he was prone, together with the chivalrous kindness which helped to make him morally lovable. The story can be told without many words. It happened when he was studying in Paris, and just at the time when, over and above his other work, he was occupied with some galvanic experiments. One evening, tired with his experimenting, and not being able to elect the facts he needed, he left his frogs and rabbits to some repose under their trying and mysterious dispensation of unexplained shocks, and went to finish his evening at the theatre of the Porte Saint Martin, where there was a melodrama which he had already seen several times, attracted not by the ingenious work of the collaborating authors, but by an actress, whose part it was to stab her lover, mistaking him for the evil designing duke of the piece. Lydgate was in love with this actress, as a man is in love with a woman whom he never expects to speak to. She was a Provençale, with dark eyes, a Greek profile, and rounded, majestic form, having that sort of beauty which carries a sweet matronliness even in youth, and her voice was a soft cooing. She had but lately come to Paris, and bore a virtuous reputation, her husband acting with her as the unfortunate lover. It was her acting which was no better than it should be, but the public was satisfied. Lydgate's only relaxation now was to go and look at this woman, just as he might have thrown himself under the breath of the sweet south on a bank of violets for a while, without prejudice to his galvanism, to which he would presently return. But this evening the old drama had a new catastrophe. At the moment when the heroine was to act the stabbing of her lover, and he was to fall gracefully, the wife veritably stabbed her husband, who fell as death willed. A wild shriek pierced the house, and the Provençal fell swooning. A shriek and a swoon were demanded by the play, but the swooning too was real this time. Lydgate leaped and climbed, he hardly knew how, on to the stage, and was active in help making the acquaintance of his heroine by finding a contusion on her head and lifting her gently in his arms. Paris rang with the story of this death. Was it murder? Some of the actress's warmest admirers were inclined to believe in her guilt, and liked her the better for it. Such was the taste of those times. But Lydgate was not one of these. He vehemently contended for her innocence, and the remote impersonal passion for her beauty, which he had felt before, had passed now into personal devotion and tender thoughts of her lot. The notion of murder was absurd. No motive was discoverable, the young couple being understood to dote on each other, and it was not unprecedented that an accidental slip of the foot should have brought these grave consequences. The legal investigation ended in Madame Loir's release. Lydgate by this time had had many interviews with her, and found her more and more adorable. She talked little, but that was an additional charm. She was melancholy and seemed grateful. Her presence was enough, like that of the evening light. Lydgate was madly anxious about her affection and jealous lest any other man than himself should win it and ask her to marry him. But instead of reopening her engagement at the Porte Saint Martin, where she would have been all the more popular for the fatal episode, she left Paris without warning, forsaking her little court of admirers. Perhaps no one carried inquiry far except Lydgate, who felt that all science had come to stand still while he imagined the unhappy Laure stricken by ever wandering sorrow, herself wandering and finding no faithful comforter. Hidden actresses, however, are not so difficult to find as some other hidden facts, and it was not long before Lydgate gathered indications that Laure had taken the route to Lyons. He found her at last, acting with great success at Avignon under the same name, looking more majestic than ever as forsaken wife carrying her child in her arms. He spoke to her after the play, was received with the usual quietude which seemed to him beautiful as clear depths of water, and obtained leave to visit her the next day, when he was bent on telling her that he adored her and on asking her to marry him. He knew that this was like the sudden impulse of a madman, incongruous even with his habitual foibles. No matter, it was the one thing which he was resolved to do. He had two selves within him apparently, and they must learn to accommodate each other and to bear reciprocal impediments. Strange that some of us, with quick alternate vision, see beyond our infatuations, and even while we rave on the heights, behold the wide plain where our persistent self pauses and awaits us. To have approached Laure with any suit that was not reverentially tender would have been simply a contradiction of his whole feeling towards her. "You have come all the way from Paris to find me?" she said to him the next day, sitting before him with folded arms, and looking at him with eyes that seemed to wander as an untamed ruminating animal wanders. "Are all Englishmen like that? I came because I could not live without trying to see you. You are lonely. I love you. I want you to consent to be my wife. I will wait, but I want you to promise that you will marry me, no one else." Laure looked at him in silence with a melancholy radiance from under her grand eyelids, until he was full of rapturous certainty he knelt close to her knees. "I will tell you something," she said in her cooing way, keeping her arms folded. "My foot really slipped." I know," said Lydgate deprecatingly. "It was a fatal accident, a dreadful stroke of calamity that bound me to you the more." Again Laure paused a little, and then said slowly, "I meant to do it." Lydgate, strong man as he was, turned pale and trembled. Moments seemed to pass before he rose and stood at a distance from her. "There was a secret then," he said at last vehemently. "He was brutal to you. You hated him." "No, he wearied me. He was too fond. He would live in Paris and not in my country. That was not agreeable to me." "Great God!" said Lydgate in a groan of horror. "And you planned to murder him?" "I did not plan. It came to me in the play. I meant to do it." Lydgate stood mute, and unconsciously pressed his hat on while he looked at her. He saw this woman, the first to whom he had given his young adoration, amid the throng of stooping criminals. "You are a good young man," she said, "but I do not like husbands. I will never have another." 3 days afterwards, Lydgate was at his galvanism again in his Paris chambers, believing that illusions were at an end for him. He was saved from hardening effects by the abundant kindness of his heart and his belief that human life might be made better. But he had more reason than ever for trusting his judgment, now that it was so experienced, and henceforth he would take a strictly scientific view of woman, entertaining no expectations but such as were justified beforehand. No one in Middlemarch was likely to have such a notion of Lydgate's past as has here been faintly shadowed, and indeed the respectable townsfolk there were not more given than mortals generally to any eager attempt at exactness in the representation of themselves of what did not come under their own senses. Not only young virgins of that town, but grey bearded men also, were often in haste to conjecture how a new acquaintance might be wrought into their purposes, contended with every vague knowledge as to the way in which life had been shaping him for that instrumentality. Middlemarch, in fact, counted on swallowing Lydgate and assimilating him very comfortably. End of chapter 15.
Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 16. All that in a woman is adored, in thy fair self I find, for the whole sex can but afford the handsome and the kind. Sir Charles Sedley. The question whether Mr. Tyke should be appointed as salaried chaplain to the hospital was an exciting topic to the Middlemarchers, and Lydgate heard it discussed in a way that threw much light on the power exercised in the town by Mr. Bulstrode. The banker was evidently a ruler, but there was an opposition party, and even among his supporters there were some who allowed it to be seen that their support was a compromise, and who frankly stated their impression that the general scheme of things, and especially the casualties of trade, required you to hold a candle to the devil. Mr. Bulstrode's power was not due simply to his being a country banker, who knew the financial secrets of most traders in the town and could touch the springs of their credit. It was fortified by a beneficence that was at once ready and severe, ready to confer obligations, and severe in watching the result. He had gathered, as an industrious man always at his post, a chief share in administering the town charities, and his private charities were both minute and abundant. He would take a great deal of pains about apprenticing Tegg, the shoemaker's son, and he would watch over Tegg's church going. He would defend Mrs. Stripe, the washerwoman, against Stubbs' unjust exaction on the score of her drying ground, and he would himself scrutinize a calumny against Mrs. Stripe. His private minor loans were numerous, but he would inquire strictly into the circumstances both before and after. In this way a man gathers a domain in his neighbour's hope and fear, as well as gratitude and power. When once it has got into that subtle region, propagates itself, spreading out of all proportion to its external means. It was a principle with Mr. Bulstrode to gain as much power as possible, that he might use it for the glory of God. He went through a great deal of spiritual conflict and inward argument in order to adjust his motives, and make clear to himself what God's glory required. But as we have seen, his motives were not always rightly appreciated. There were many crass minds in Middlemarch whose reflective scales could only weigh things in the lump, and they had a strong suspicion that since Mr. Bulstrode could not enjoy life in their fashion, eating and drinking so little as he did, and worreting himself about everything, he must have a sort of vampire's feast in the sense of mastery. The subject of the chaplaincy came up at Mr. Vincey's table when Lydgate was dining there, and the family connection with Mr. Bulstrode did not, he observed, prevent some freedom of remark even on the part of the host himself, though his reasons against the proposed arrangement turned entirely on his objection to Mr. Tyke's sermons, which were all doctrine, and his preference for Mr. Fairbrother, whose sermons were free from that taint. Mr. Vincey liked well enough the notion of the chaplain's having a salary, supposing it were given to Fairbrother, who was as good a little fellow as ever breathed, and the best preacher anywhere, and companionable too. "What line shall you take then?" said Mr. Chichley, the coroner, a great coursing comrade of Mr. Vincey's. "Oh, I am precious glad I am not one of the directors now. I shall vote for referring the matter to the directors and the medical board together. I shall roll some of my responsibility on your shoulders, doctor," said Mr. Vincey, glancing first at Dr. Sprague, the senior physician of the town, and then at Lydgate, who sat opposite. "You medical gentlemen must consult which sort of black draught you will prescribe, Mr. Lydgate?" "I know little of either," said Lydgate, "but in general appointments are apt to be made too much a question of personal liking. The fittest man for a particular post is not always the best fellow or the most agreeable. Sometimes, if you wanted to get a reform, your only way would be to pension off the good fellows whom everybody is fond of, and put them out of the question." Dr. Sprague, who was considered the physician of most weight, though Dr. Minchin was usually said to have more penetration, divested his large, heavy face of all expression and looked at his wine glass while Lydgate was speaking. Whatever was not problematical and suspected about this young man, for example, a certain showiness as to foreign ideas and a disposition to unsettle what had been settled and forgotten by his elders, was positively unwelcome to a physician whose standing had been fixed 30 years before by the treatise on meningitis, of which at least one copy marked "Own" was bound in calf. For my part, I have some fellow feeling with Dr. Sprague. One's self satisfaction is an untaxed kind of property which it is very unpleasant to find deprecated. Lydgate's remark, however, did not meet the sense of the company. Mr. Vincey said that if he could have his way, he would not put disagreeable fellows anywhere. "Hang your reforms," said Mr. Chichely. "There is no greater humbug in the world. You never hear of a reform, but it means some trick to put in new men. I hope you are not one of the Lancet's men, Mr. Lydgate, wanting to take the coronership out of the hands of the legal profession. Your words appear to point that way." "I disapprove of Wakely," interposed Dr. Sprague. "No man more. He is an ill intentioned fellow, who would sacrifice the respectability of the profession, which everybody knows depends on the London colleges, for the sake of getting some notoriety for himself. There are men who don't mind about being kicked blue if they can only get talked about. But Wakely is right sometimes," the doctor added judicially. "I could mention one or two points in which Wakely is in the right." "Oh, well," said Mr. Chitley, "I blame no man for standing up in favor of his own cloth. But coming to argument, I should like to know how a coroner is to judge of evidence if he has not had a legal training." "In my opinion," said Lydgate, "legal training only makes a man more incompetent in questions that require knowledge of another kind. People talk about evidence as if it could really be weighed in scales by a blind justice. No man can judge what is good evidence on any particular subject unless he knows that subject well. A lawyer is no better than an old woman at a post mortem examination. How is he to know the action of a poison? You might as well say that scanning verse will teach you to scan the potato crops." "You were aware, I suppose, that it is not the coroner's business to conduct the post mortem, but only to take the evidence of the medical witness?" said Mr. Chichely with some scorn. "Who is often almost as ignorant as the coroner himself," said Lydgate. "Questions of medical jurisprudence ought not to be left to the chance of decent knowledge in a medical witness, and the coroner ought not to be a man who will believe that strychnine will destroy the coats of the stomach if an ignorant practitioner happens to tell him so." Lydgate had really lost sight of the fact that Mr. Chichely was His Majesty's coroner, and ended innocently with the question, "Don't you agree with me, Dr. Sprague?" "To a certain extent, with regard to populous districts and in the metropolis," said the doctor. "But I hope it will be long before this part of the country loses the services of my friend Chichely, even though it might get the best man in our profession to succeed him. I am sure Vincey will agree with me." "Yes, yes, give me a coroner who is a good coursing man," said Mr. Vincey jovially, "and in my opinion you are safest with a lawyer. Nobody can know everything. Most things are visitation of God. And as to poisoning, why, what you want to know is the law. Come, shall we join the ladies?" Lydgate's private opinion was that Mr. Chichely might be the very coroner without bias as to the coats of the stomach, but he had not meant to be personal. This was one of the difficulties of moving in good Middlemarch society. It was dangerous to insist on knowledge as a qualification for any salaried office. Fred Vincey had called Lydgate a prig, and now Mr. Chichely was inclined to call him prick-eared, especially when in the drawing room he seemed to be making himself eminently agreeable to Rosamond, whom he had easily monopolized in a tete-a-tete since Mrs. Vincey herself sat at the tea table. She resigned no domestic function to her daughter, and the matron's blooming good natured face, with the two volatile pink strings floating from her fine throat, and her cheery manners to husband and children was certainly among the great attractions of the Vincy house, attractions which made it all the easier to fall in love with the daughter. The tinge of unpretentious, inoffensive vulgarity in Mrs. Vincy gave more effect to Rosamond's refinement, which was beyond what Lydgate had expected. Certainly, small feet and perfectly turned shoulders aid the impression of refined manners, and the right thing said seems quite astonishingly right when it is accompanied with exquisite curves of lip and eyelid. And Rosamond could say the right thing, for she was clever with that sort of cleverness which catches every tone except the humorous. Happily, she never attempted to joke, and this perhaps was the most decisive mark of her cleverness. She and Lydgate readily got into conversation. He regretted that he had not heard her sing the other day at Stonecourt. The only pleasure he allowed himself during the latter part of his stay in Paris was to go and hear music. "You have studied music, probably?" said Rosamond. "No, I know the notes of many birds, and I know many melodies by ear, but the music that I don't know at all, and have no notion about, delights me, affects me. How stupid the world is that it does not make more use of such a pleasure within its reach." "Yes, and you will find Middlemarch very tuneless. There are hardly any good musicians. I only know two gentlemen who sing at all well. I suppose it is the fashion to sing comic songs in a rhythmic way, leaving you to fancy the tune very much as if it were trapped on a drum." "Ah, you have heard Mr. Bower," said Rosamond, with one of her rare smiles, "but we are speaking very ill of our neighbors." Lydgate was almost forgetting that he must carry on the conversation in thinking how lovely this creature was, her garments seeming to be made out of the faintest blue sky, herself so immaculately blonde as if the petals of some gigantic flower had just opened and disclosed her, and yet with this infantine blondness showing so much ready, self possessed grace. Since he had had the memory of Laurie, Lydgate had lost all taste for large eyed silence. The divine cow no longer attracted him, and Rosamond was her very opposite, but he recalled himself. "You will let me hear some music tonight, I hope?" "I will let you hear my attempts, if you like," said Rosamond. "Papa is sure to insist on my singing, but I shall tremble before you, who have heard the best singers in Paris. I have heard very little. I have only once been to London. But our organist at St. Peter's is a good musician, and I go on studying with him. Tell me what you saw in London." "Very little." A more naive girl would have said, "Oh, everything," but Rosamond knew better. "A few of the ordinary sights, such as raw country girls are always taken to." "Do you call yourself a raw country girl?" said Lydgate, looking at her with an involuntary emphasis of admiration, which made Rosamond blush with pleasure. But she remained simply serious, turned her long neck a little, and put up her hand to touch her wondrous hair plaits, an habitual gesture with her as pretty as any movements of a kitten's paw. Not that Rosamond was in the least like a kitten. She was a sylph, caught young and educated at Mrs. Lemon's. "I assure you my mind is raw," she said immediately. "I pass at Middlemarch. I am not afraid of talking to our old neighbors, but I am really afraid of you. An accomplished woman almost always knows more than we men, though her knowledge is of a different sort. I am sure you should teach me 1,000 things, as an exquisite bird would teach a bear, if there were any common language between them. Happily, there is a common language between women and men, and so the bears can get taught." "Ah, there is Fred beginning to strum. I must go and hinder him from jarring all your nerves," said Rosamond, moving to the other side of the room, where Fred, having opened the piano at his father's desire that Rosamond might give them some music, was parenthetically performing Cherry Ripe with one hand. Able men who have passed their examinations will do these things sometimes, not less than the plucked Fred. "Fred, pray defer your practising till tomorrow. You will make Mr. Lydgate ill," said Rosamond. "He has an ear." Fred laughed, and went on with his tune to the end. Rosamond turned to Lydgate, smiling gently, and said, You perceive the bears will not always be taught. Now then, Rosie, said Fred, springing from the stool and twisting it upward for her, with a hearty expectation of enjoyment. Some good rousing tunes first. Rosamond played admirably. Her master at Mrs. Lemon's school, close to a country town with a memorable history that had its relics in church and castle, was one of those excellent musicians here and there to be found in our provinces, worthy to compare with many a noted kapellmeister in a country which offers more plentiful conditions of musical celebrity. Rosamond, with the executant's instinct, had seized his manner of playing, and gave forth his large rendering of noble music with the precision of an echo. It was almost startling, heard for the first time. A hidden soul seemed to be flowing forth from Rosamond's fingers, and so indeed it was, since souls live on in perpetual echoes, and to all fine expression there goes somewhere an originating activity, if it be only that of an interpreter. Lydgate was taken possession of, and began to believe in her as something exceptional. After all, he thought, one need not be surprised to find the rare conjunctions of nature under circumstances apparently unfavorable. Come where they may, they always depend on conditions that are not obvious. He sat looking at her, and did not rise to pay her any compliments, leaving that to others, now that his admiration was deepened. Her singing was less remarkable, but also well trained, and sweet to hear as a chime perfectly in tune. It is true, she sang, meet me by moonlight, and I have been roaming, for mortals must share the fashions of their time, and none but the ancients can be always classical. But Rosamond could also sing Black Eyed Susan with effect, or Haydn's canzonets, or Voi che sapete, or Batti Batti. She only wanted to know what her audience liked. Her father looked round at the company, delighting in their admiration. Her mother sat, like a Noebe before her troubles, with her youngest little girl on her lap, softly beating the child's hand up and down in time to the music. And Fred, notwithstanding his general skepticism about Rosie, listened to her music with perfect allegiance, wishing he could do the same thing on his flute. It was the pleasantest family party that Lydgate had seen since he came to Middlemarch. The Vinceys had the readiness to enjoy, the rejection of all anxiety, and the belief in life as a merry lot, which made a house exceptional in most county towns at that time, when evangelicalism had cast a certain suspicion as of plague infection over the few amusements which survived in the provinces. At the Vinceys there was always whist, and the card tables stood ready now, making some of the company secretly impatient of the music. Before it ceased, Mr. Fairbrother came in, a handsome, broad chested, but otherwise small man, about 40, whose black was very threadbare. The brilliancy was all in his quick grey eyes. He came like a pleasant change in the light, arresting little Louisa with fatherly nonsense as she was being led out of the room by Miss Morgan, greeting everybody with some special word, and seeming to condense more talk into 10 minutes than had been held all through the evening. He claimed from Lydgate the fulfillment of a promise to come and see him. I can't let you off, you know, because I have some beetles to show you. We collectors feel an interest in every new man till he has seen all we have to show him. But soon he swerved to the whist table, rubbing his hands and saying, come now, let us be serious. Mr. Lydgate, not play? Ah, you are too young and light for this kind of thing. Lydgate said to himself that the clergyman, whose abilities were so painful to Mr. Bulstrode, appeared to have found an agreeable resort in this certainly not erudite household. He could half understand it. The good humour, the good looks of elder and younger, and the provision for passing the time without any labour of intelligence, might make the house big willing to people who had no particular use for their odd hours. Everything looked blooming and joyous except Miss Morgan, who was brown, dull, and resigned, and altogether, as Mrs. Vincey often said, just the sort of person for a governess. Lydgate did not mean to pay many such visits himself. They were a wretched waste of the evenings, and now, when he had talked a little more to Rosamond, he meant to excuse himself and go. "You will not like us at Middlemarch, I feel sure," she said, when the whist players were settled. "We are very stupid, and you have been used to something quite different." "I suppose all country towns are pretty much alike," said Lydgate, "but I have noticed that one always believes one's own town to be more stupid than any other. I have made up my mind to take Middlemarch as it comes, and shall be much obliged if the town will take me in the same way. I have certainly found some charms in it which are much greater than I had expected." "You mean the rides towards Tipton and Lowick? Everyone is pleased with those," said Rosamond with simplicity. "No, I mean something much nearer to me." Rosamond rose and reached her netting, and then said, "Do you care about dancing at all? I am not quite sure whether clever men ever dance." "I would dance with you if you would allow me." "Oh," said Rosamond, with a slight deprecatory laugh, "I was only going to say that we sometimes have dancing, and I wanted to know whether you would feel insulted if you were asked to come." "Not on the condition I mentioned." After this chat, Lydgate thought that he was going, but on moving towards the whist tables, he got interested in watching Mr. Fairbrother's play, which was masterly, and also his face, which was a striking mixture of the shrewd and the mild. At 10 o'clock supper was brought in. Such were the customs of Middlemarch, and there was a punch drinking, but Mr. Fairbrother had only a glass of water. He was winning, but there seemed to be no reason why the renewal of rubbers should end, and Lydgate at last took his leave. But as it was not 11 o'clock, he chose to walk in the brisk air towards the tower of St. Botolph's, Mr. Fairbrother's church, which stood out dark, square, and massive against the starlight. It was the oldest church in Middlemarch. The living, however, was but a vicarage worth barely 400 a year. Lydgate had heard that, and he wondered now whether Mr. Fairbrother cared about the money he won at cards, thinking, "He seems a very pleasant fellow, but Bulstrode may have his good reasons." Many things would be easier to Lydgate if it should turn out that Mr. Bulstrode was generally justifiable. What is his religious doctrine to me if he carries some good notions along with it? One must use such brains as are to be found. These were actually Lydgate's first meditations as he walked away from Mr. Vincey's, and on this ground I fear that many ladies will consider him hardly worthy of their attention. He thought of Rosamond and her music only in the second place, and though, when her turn came, he dwelt on the image of her for the rest of his walk, he felt no agitation, and had no sense that any new current had set into his life. He could not marry yet. He wished not to marry for several years, and therefore he was not ready to entertain the notion of being in love with a girl whom he happened to admire. He did admire Rosamond exceedingly, but that madness which had once beset him about Lorry was not, he thought, likely to occur in relation to any other woman. Certainly, if falling in love had been at all in question, it would have been quite safe with a creature like this Miss Vincey, who had just the kind of intelligence one would desire in a woman, polished, refined, docile, lending itself to finish in all the delicacies of life, and enshrined in a body which expressed this with a force of demonstration that excluded the need for other evidence. Lydgate felt sure that if ever he married, his wife would have that feminine radiance, that distinctive womanhood which must be classed with flowers and music, that sort of beauty which by its very nature was virtuous, being moulded only for pure and delicate joys. But since he did not mean to marry for the next 5 years, his more pressing business was to look into Lois's new book on fever, which he was specially interested in because he had known Lois in Paris, and had followed many anatomical demonstrations in order to ascertain the specific differences of typhus and typhoid. He went home and read far into the smallest hour, bringing a much more testing vision of details and relations into this pathological study than he had ever thought it necessary to apply to the complexities of love and marriage, these being subjects on which he felt himself amply informed by literature, and that traditional wisdom which is handed down in the genial conversation of men, whereas fever had obscure conditions, and gave him that delightful labor of the imagination which is not mere arbitrariness, but the exercise of disciplined power, combining and constructing with the clearest eye for probabilities and the fullest obedience to knowledge, and then, in yet more energetic alliance with impartial nature, standing aloof to invent tests by which to try its own work. Many men have been praised as vividly imaginative on the strength of their profuseness, indifferent drawing, or cheap narration. Reports of very poor talk going on in distant orbs, or portraits of Lucifer coming down on his bad errands as a largely ugly man with bat's wings and spurts of phosphorescence, or exaggerations of wantonness that seem to reflect life in a diseased dream. But these kinds of inspiration Lydgate regarded as rather vulgar and vinous compared with the imagination that reveals subtle actions inaccessible by any sort of lens, but tracked in that outer darkness through long pathways of necessary sequence by the inward light which is the last refinement of energy, capable of bathing even the ethereal atoms in its ideally illuminated space. He, for his part, had tossed away all cheap inventions where ignorance finds itself able and at ease. He was enamored of that arduous invention which is the very eye of research, provisionally framing its object and correcting it to more and more exactness of relation. He wanted to pierce the obscurity of those minute processes which prepare human misery and joy, those invisible thoroughfares which are the first lurking places of anguish, mania, and crime, that delicate poise and transition which determine the growth of happy or unhappy consciousness. As he threw down his book, stretched his legs towards the embers in the grate, and clasped his hands at the back of his head, in that agreeable afterglow of excitement when thought lapses from examination of a specific object into a suffusive sense of its connections with all the rest of our existence, seems as it were to throw itself on its back after vigorous swimming and float with the repose of unexhausted strength. Lydgate felt a triumphant delight in his studies, and something like pity for those less lucky men who were not of his profession. If I had not taken that turn when I was a lad, he thought, I might have gone into some stupid draught horse work or other, and lived always in blinkers. I should never have been happy in any profession that did not call forth the highest intellectual strain, and yet keep me in good warm contact with my neighbors. There is nothing like the medical profession for that. One can have the exclusive scientific life that touches the distance and befriend the old fogies in the parish too. It is rather harder for a clergyman. Fairbrother seems to be an anomaly. This last thought brought back the Vinceys and all the pictures of the evening. They floated in his mind agreeably enough, and as he took up his bed candle his lips were curled with that incipient smile which is apt to accompany agreeable recollections. He was an ardent fellow, but at present his ardor was absorbed in love of his work and in the ambition of making his life recognized as a factor in the better life of mankind, like other heroes of science who had nothing but an obscure country practice to begin with. Poor Lydgate, or shall I say poor Rosamond? Each lived in a world of which the other knew nothing. It had not occurred to Lydgate that he had been a subject of eager meditation to Rosamond, who had neither any reason for throwing her marriage into distant perspective, nor any pathological studies to divert her mind from that ruminating habit, that inward repetition of looks, words, and phrases which makes a large part in the lives of most girls. He had not meant to look at her or speak to her with more than the inevitable amount of admiration and compliment which a man must give to a beautiful girl. Indeed, it seemed to him that his enjoyment of her music had remained almost silent, for he feared falling into the rudeness of telling her his great surprise at her possession of such accomplishment. But Rosamond had registered every look and word, and estimated them as the opening incidents of a preconceived romance, incidents which gather value from the foreseen development and climax. In Rosamund's romance, it was not necessary to imagine much about the inward life of the hero, or of his serious business in the world. Of course, he had a profession, and was clever, as well as sufficiently handsome, but the piquant fact about Lydgate was his good birth, which distinguished him from all Middlemarch admirers, and presented marriage as a prospect of rising in rank, and getting a little nearer to that celestial condition on earth in which she would have nothing to do with vulgar people, and perhaps at last associate with relatives quite equal to the country people who looked down on the Middlemarchers. It was part of Rosamund's cleverness to discern very subtly the faintest aroma of rank, and once when she had been the Miss Brooks accompanying their uncle at the country assizes, and seated among the aristocracy, she had envied them, notwithstanding their plain dress. If you think it incredible that to imagine Lydgate as a man of family could cause thrills of satisfaction which had anything to do with the sense that she was in love with him, I will ask you to use your power of comparison a little more effectively, and consider whether red cloth and epaulettes have never had an influence of that sort. Our passions do not live apart in locked chambers, but, dressed in their small wardrobe of notions, bring their provisions to a common table and mess together, feeding out of the common store according to their appetite. Rosamond, in fact, was entirely occupied not exactly with Tertius Lydgate as he was in himself, but with his relation to her, and it was excusable in a girl who was accustomed to hear that all young men might, could, would be, or actually were in love with her, to believe at once that Lydgate could be no exception. His looks and words meant more to her than other men's, because she cared more for them. She thought of them diligently, and diligently attended to that perfection of appearance, behavior, sentiments, and all other elegancies which would find in Lydgate a more adequate admirer than she had yet been conscious of. For Rosamond, though she would never do anything that was disagreeable to her, was industrious, and now more than ever she was active in sketching her landscapes and market cards and portraits of friends, in practicing her music, and in being from morning till night her own standard of a perfect lady, having always an audience in her own consciousness, with sometimes the not unwelcome addition of a more variable external audience in the numerous visitors of the house. She found time also to read the best novels, and even the second best, and she knew much poetry by heart. Her favorite poem was Lalla Rookh, the best girl in the world. He will be a happy fellow who gets her, was the sentiment of the elderly gentlemen who visited the Vinceys, and the rejected young men thought of trying again, as is the fashion in country towns where the horizon is not thick with coming rivals. But Mrs. Plymdale thought that Rosamond had been educated to a ridiculous pitch. For what was the use of accomplishment which would be all laid aside as soon as she was married? While her aunt Bulstrode, who had a sisterly faithfulness towards her brother's family, had two sincere wishes for Rosamond, that she might show a more serious turn of mind, and that she might meet with a husband whose wealth corresponded to her habits. End of chapter 16. Middlemarch by George Eliot. Chapter 17. The clerkly person smiled and said, Promise was a pretty maid, but being poor she died unwed. The Reverend Camden Fairbrother, whom Lydgate went to see the next evening, lived in an old parsonage, built of stone, venerable enough to match the church which it looked out upon. All the furniture, too, in the house was old, but with another grade of age. that of Mr. Fairbrother's father and grandfather. There were painted white chairs, with gilding and wreaths on them, and some lingering red silk damask with slits in it. There were engraved portraits of Lord Chancellors and other celebrated lawyers of the last century, and there were old pier glasses to reflect them, as well as the little satin wood tables and the sofas resembling a prolongation of uneasy chairs, all standing in relief against the dark wainscot. This was the physiognomy of the drawing room into which Lydgate was shown, and there were three ladies to receive him, who were also old fashioned, and of a faded but genuine respectability. Mrs. Fairbrother, the vicar's white haired mother, befrilled and kerchiefed with dainty cleanliness, upright, quick eyed, and still under 70. Miss Noble, her sister, a tiny old lady of meeker aspect, with frills and kerchief decidedly more worn and mended, and Miss Winifred Fairbrother, the vicar's elder sister, well looking like himself, but nipped and subdued as single women are apt to be who spend their lives in uninterrupted subjection to their elders. Lydgate had not expected to see so quaint a group. Knowing simply that Mr. Fairbrother was a bachelor, he had thought of being ushered into a snuggery where the chief furniture would probably be books and collections of natural objects. The vicar himself seemed to wear rather a changed aspect, as most men do when acquaintances made elsewhere see them for the first time in their own homes, some indeed showing like an actor of genial parts disadvantageously cast for the curmudgeon in a new piece. This was not the case with Mr. Fairbrother. He seemed a trifle milder and more silent, the chief talker being his mother, while he only put in a good humoured moderating remark here and there. The old lady was evidently accustomed to tell her company what they ought to think, and to regard no subject as quite safe without her steering. She was afforded leisure for this function by having all her little wants attended to by Miss Winifred. Meanwhile, tiny Miss Noble carried on her arm a small basket, into which she diverted a bit of sugar, which she had first dropped in her saucer as if by mistake, looking round furtively afterwards, and reverting to her teacup with a small innocent noise as of a tinny timid quadruped. Pray think no ill of Miss Noble. That basket held small savings from her more portable food, destined for the children of her poor friends, among whom she trotted on fine mornings, fostering and petting all needy creatures, being so spontaneous a delight to her, that she regarded it much as if it had been a pleasant vice that she was addicted to. Perhaps she was conscious of being tempted to steal from those who had much that she might give to those who had nothing, and carried in her conscience the guilt of that repressed desire. One must be poor to know the luxury of giving. Mrs. Fairbrother welcomed the guest with a lively formality and precision. She presently informed him that they were not often in want of medical aid in that house. She had brought up her children to wear flannel and not to overeat themselves, which last habit she considered the chief reason why people needed doctors. Lydgate pleaded for those whose fathers and mothers had overeaten themselves, but Mrs. Fairbrother held that view of things dangerous. Nature was more just than that. It would be easy for any felon to say that his ancestors ought to have been hanged instead of him. If those he had bad fathers and mothers were bad themselves, they were hanged for that. There was no need to go back on what you couldn't see. My mother is like old George III, said the vicar. She objects to metaphysics. I object to what is wrong, Camden. I say, keep hold of a few plain truths, and make everything square with them. When I was young, Mr. Lydgate, there never was any question about right and wrong. We knew our catechism, and that was enough. We learned our creed and our duty. Every respectable church person had the same opinions. But now, if you speak out of the prayer book itself, you are liable to be contradicted. That makes rather a pleasant time of it for those who like to maintain their own point, said Lydgate. But my mother always gives way, said the vicar slyly. No, no, Camden, you must not lead Mr. Lygate into a mistake about me. I shall never show that disrespect to my parents, to give up what they taught me. Any one may see what comes of turning. If you change once, why not 20 times? A man might see good arguments for changing once and not see them for changing again, said Lydgate, amused with the decisive old lady. Excuse me there. If you go up on arguments, they are never wanting when a man has no constancy of mind. My father never changed, and he preached plain moral sermons without arguments, and was a good man. Few better. When you get me a good man made out of arguments, I will get you a good dinner with reading you the cookery book. That's my opinion, and I think anybody's stomach will bear me out. About the dinner, certainly, mother, said Mr. Fairbrother. It is the same thing, the dinner or the man. I'm nearly 70, Mr. Lydgate, and I go upon experience. I am not likely to follow new lights, though there are plenty of them here as elsewhere. I say they came in with the mixed stuffs that will neither wash nor wear. I was not so in my youth. A churchman was a churchman, and a clergyman, you might be pretty sure, was a gentleman, if nothing else. But now he may be no better than a dissenter, and want to push aside my son on pretence of doctrine. But whoever may wish to push him aside, I am proud to say, Mr. Lydgate, that he will compare with any preacher in this kingdom, not to speak of this town, which is but a low standard to go by, at least to my thinking, for I was born and bred at Exeter. A mother is never partial, said Mr. Fairbrother, smiling. What do you think Tyke's mother says about him? Ah, poor creature! What indeed? Said Mrs. Fairbrother, her sharpness blunted for the moment by her confidence in maternal judgments. She says the truth to herself, depend upon it. And what is the truth? Said Lydgate. I am curious to know. Oh, nothing bad at all, said Mr. Fairbrother. He is a zealous fellow, not very learned and not very wise, I think, because I don't agree with him. Why, Camden, said Miss Winifred, Griffin and his wife told me only today that Mr. Tyke said they should have no more colds if they came to hear you preach. Mrs. Fairbrother laid down her knitting, which she had resumed after her small allowance of tea and toast, and looked at her son as if to say, You hear that? Miss Noble said, Oh, poor things, in reference probably to the double loss of preaching and coal. But the vicar answered quietly, That is because they are not my parishioners, and I don't think my sermons are worth a load of coals to them. Mr. Lydgate, said Mrs. Fairbrother, who could not let this pass, you don't know my son. He always undervalues himself. I tell him he is undervaluing the God who made him, and made him a most excellent preacher. That must be a hint for me to take Mr. Lydgate away to my study, mother, said the vicar, laughing. I promised to show you my collection, he added, turning to Lydgate. Shall we go? All three ladies remonstrated. Mr. Lydgate ought not to be hurried away without being allowed to accept another cup of tea. Miss Winifred had abundance of good tea in the pot. Why was Camden in such a haste to take a visitor to his den? There was nothing but pickled vermin, and drawers full of blue bottles and moths, with no carpet on the floor. Mr. Lydgate must excuse it. A game at cribbage would be far better. In short, it was plain that a vicar might be adored by his womankind as the king of men and preachers, and yet be held by them to stand in much need of their direction. Lydgate, with the usual shallowness of a young bachelor, wondered that Mr. Fairbrother had not taught them better. My mother is not used to my having visitors who can take any interest in my hobbies, said the vicar, as he opened the door of his study, which was indeed as bare of luxuries for the body as the ladies had implied, unless a short porcelain pipe and a tobacco box were to be excepted. Men of your profession don't generally smoke, he said. Lydgate smiled and shook his head. Nor of mine either, properly, I suppose. You will hear that pipe alleged against me by Bulstrode and Company. They don't know how pleased the devil would be if I gave it up. I understand. You are of an excitable temper and want a sedative. I am heavier and should get idle with it. I should rush into idleness and stagnate there with all my might. And you mean to give it all to your work. I am some 10 or 12 years older than you, and have come to a compromise. I feed a weakness or two, lest they should get clamorous. See, continued the vicar, opening several small drawers, I fancy I have made an exhaustive study of the entomology of this district. I am going on both with the fauna and the flora, but I have at least done my insects well. We are singularly rich in Orthoptera. I don't know whether. Ah, you have got hold of that glass jar. You are looking into that instead of my drawers. You don't really care about these things? Not by the side of this lovely anencephalous monster. I have never had time to give myself much to natural history. I was early bitten with an interest in structure, and it is what lies most directly in my profession. I have no hobby besides. I have the sea to swim in there. Ah, you are a happy fellow, said Mr. Fairbrother, turning on his heel and beginning to fill his pipe. You don't know what it is to want spiritual tobacco, bad emendations of old texts, or small items about a variety of Apis brassicae, with the well known signature of Philomicron for the Twaddler's Magazine, or a learned treatise on the entomology of the Pentateuch, including all the insects not mentioned, but probably met with by the Israelites in their passage through the desert, with a monograph on the ant as treated by Solomon, showing the harmony of the book of Proverbs with the results of modern research. You don't mind my fumigating you? Lydgate was more surprised at the openness of this talk than at its implied meaning, that the vicar felt himself not altogether in the right vocation. The neat fitting up of drawers and shelves, and the bookcase filled with the expensive illustrated books on natural history, made him think again of the winnings at cards and their destination. But he was beginning to wish that the very best construction of everything that Mr. Fairbrother did should be the true one. The vicar's frankness seemed not of the repulsive sort that comes from an uneasy consciousness seeking to forestall the judgment of others, but simply the relief of a desire to do with as little pretense as possible. Apparently, he was not without a sense that his freedom of speech might seem premature, for he presently said, I have not yet told you that I have the advantage of you, Mr. Lydgate, and know you better than you know me. You remember Trolley, who shared your apartment at Paris for some time? I was a correspondent of his, and he told me a good deal about you. I was not quite sure when you first came that you were the same man. I was very glad when I found that you were. Only I don't forget that you have not had the like prologue about me. Lydgate divined some delicacy of feeling here, but did not half understand it. By the way, he said, what has become of Trolley? I have quite lost sight of him. He was hot on the French social systems, and talked of going to the backwoods to found a sort of Pythagorean community. Is he gone? Not at all. He is practicing at a German bath, and has married a rich patient. Then my notions were the best so far, said Lydgate, with a short, scornful laugh. He would have it. The medical profession was an inevitable system of humbug. I said the fault was in the men who truckle to lies and folly. Instead of preaching against humbug outside the walls, it might be better to set up a disinfecting apparatus within. In short, I am reporting my own conversation. You may be sure I had all the good sense on my side. Your scheme is a good deal more difficult to carry out than the Pythagorean community, though. You have not only got the old Adam in yourself against you, but you have got all those descendants of the original Adam who formed the society around you. You see, I have paid 12 or 13 years more than you for my knowledge of difficulties. But Mr. Fairbrother broke off a moment, and then added, you are eyeing that glass vase again. Do you want to make an exchange? You shall not have it without a fair barter. I have some sea mice, fine specimens in spirits, and I will throw in Robert Brown's new thing, microscopic observations on the pollen of plants, if you don't happen to have it already. Why, seeing how you long for the monster, I might ask a higher price. Suppose I ask you to look through my drawers and agree with me about all my new species. The vicar, while he talked in this way, alternately moved about with his pipe in his mouth and returned to hang rather fondly over his drawers. That would be good discipline, for a young doctor who has to please his patients in Middlemarch. You must learn to be bored, remember. However, you shall have the monster on your own terms. Don't you think men overrate the necessity for humoring everybody's nonsense till they get despised by the very fools they humor? Said Lydgate, moving to Mr. Fairbrother's side, and looking rather absently at the insects ranged in fine gradation, with names subscribed in exquisite writing. The shortest way is to make your value felt, so that people must put up with you whether you flatter them or not. With all my heart, but then you must be sure of having the value, and you must keep yourself independent. Very few men can do that. Either you slip out of service altogether and become good for nothing, or you wear the harness and draw a good deal where your yokefellows pull you. But do look at these delicate orthoptera. Lydgate had, after all, to give some scrutiny to each drawer, the vicar laughing at himself and yet persisting in the exhibition. Apropos of what you said about wearing harness, Lydgate began, after they had sat down, I made up my mind some time ago to do with as little of it as possible. That was why I determined not to try anything in London, for a good many years at least. I didn't like what I saw when I was studying there, so much empty bigwigism and obstructive trickery. In the country, people have less pretension to knowledge, and are less of companions. But for that reason, they affect one's amour propre less. One makes less bad blood, and one can follow one's own course more quietly. Yes, well, you have got a good start. You are in the right profession, the work you feel yourself most fit for. Some people miss that and repent too late, but you must not be too sure of keeping your independence. You mean of family ties? Said Lydgate, conceiving that these might press rather tightly on Mr. Fairbrother. Not altogether. Of course, they make many things more difficult. But a good wife, a good unworldly woman, may really help a man, and keep him more independent. There's a parishioner of mine, a fine fellow, but who would hardly have pulled through as he has done without his wife. Do you know the Garths? I think they were not Peacock's patients. No, but there is a Miss Garth at old Featherstone's at Lowick, their daughter, an excellent girl. She is very quiet. I have hardly noticed her. She has taken notice of you, though, depend upon it. I don't understand, said Dilgate. He could hardly say, of course. Oh, she gorges everybody. I prepared her for confirmation. She is a favourite of mine. Mr. Fairbrother puffed a few moments in silence, Lydgate not caring to know more about the Garths. At last the vicar laid down his pipe, stretched out his legs, and turned his bright eyes with a smile towards Lydgate, saying, But we Middlemarchers are not so tame as you take us to be. We have our intrigues and our parties. I'm a party man, for example, and Bulstrode is another. If you vote for me, you will offend Bulstrode. What is there against Bulstrode? Said Lydgate emphatically. I did not say there was anything against him, except that if you vote against him, you will make him your enemy. I don't know that I need mind about that, said Lydgate, rather proudly. But he seems to have good ideas about hospitals, and he spends large sums on useful public objects. He might help me a good deal in carrying out my ideas. As to his religious notions, why, as Voltaire said, incantations will destroy a flock of sheep if administered with a certain quantity of arsenic. I look for the man who will bring the arsenic and don't mind about his incantations. Very good, but then you must not offend your arsenic man. You will not offend me, said Mr. Fairbrother quite unaffectedly. I don't translate my own convenience into other people's duties. I am opposed to Bulstrode in many ways. I don't like the set he belongs to. They are a narrow, ignorant set, and do more to make their neighbors uncomfortable than to make them better. Their system is a sort of worldly spiritual clickbaitism. They really look on the rest of mankind as a doomed carcass which is to nourish them for heaven. But, he added smilingly, I don't say that Bulstrode's new hospital is a bad thing. And as to his wanting to oust me from the old one, why, if he thinks me a mischievous fellow, he is only returning a compliment. And I am not a model clergyman, only a decent makeshift. Lydgate was not at all sure that the vicar maligned himself. A model clergyman, like a model doctor, ought to think his own profession the finest in the world, and take all knowledge as mere nourishment to his moral pathology and therapeutics. He only said, What reason does Bulstrode give for superseding you? That I don't teach his opinions, which he calls spiritual religion, and that I have no time to spare. Both statements are true, but then I could make time, and I should be glad of the £40. That is the plain fact of the case, but let us dismiss it. I only wanted to tell you that if you vote for your arsenic man, you are not to cut me in consequence. I can't spare you. You are a sort of circumnavigator come to settle among us, and will keep up my belief in the antipodes. Now tell me all about them in Paris. End of chapter 17.